Curse of the Fae, Fae Wild Series Book 2, written by wjmay, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 14. Exhaustion made her limbs feel heavy, but there was no chance of sleep tonight. Lena sat on her bed, her eyes trained on the side window in her room. She put on her breeches earlier and paired it with a dark tunic top she borrowed from Pigeon. It was tucked in tight so that it didn't billow around her. A borrowed black cloak sat beside her, ready to be donned at a moment's notice. When she'd limped into the mess hall later, Pigeon was there waiting for her. She'd fussed over her, fetching her dinner and insisting she eat to replenish her strength. Lena felt defeated, confined to a life of punishment for sins she couldn't remember, but some time spent with her friend helped to dispel some of the dark clouds around her. Lena had filled her in on what happened with the eye, then told her how Torva had banished Braken from the academy.
"Who is the Eater of Worlds?" Pigeon asked, her brow furrowed. "He sounds like a goat we had on the farm when I was younger. Eventually he ate too many nettles and his stomach burst."
Lena moved past the cautionary tale to reveal that she had no clue who the hellspawn was talking about, then filled her in on what she'd seen during the King's Day feast. "I think the Eater of Worlds is the one who crashed the King's party." Pigeon was taken aback by this news.
"No wonder Torva is going at you with such intensity. If the king is in danger, then it's all of our duties to protect him."
"My only duty is to discover my role in all of this," Lena muttered. "King Liar's powerful enough to take care of himself. I'm the one being put through the ringer every day in his name." Pigeon had patted her on the back gently.
"I can't imagine how hard this must be for you."
"Not for much longer. Braken said we would visit Lynetta Chimera tonight," she said, low enough that her nearby guards couldn't overhear.
"But Torva said he isn't allowed back into the academy," Pigeon countered. "How is he going to get you out when he can't even get in himself?"
Lena hadn't had an answer ready. "I don't know, but it's the only hope I have, so I'm going to cling to it."
"If you're going to try to sneak out, you'll need to wear something dark," Pigeon pointed out. That was how she ended up with the dark clothing and advice on how not to be seen. Her plump friend seemed to pride herself on her stealth, and Lena was happy for any pointers that would lead to her escaping her prison. Hours passed and Lena sat, waiting, hoping for Braken to arrive. She had expected him to create some sort of diversion to sneak her out the door, but that would mean he'd have to find a way to enter the academy without being caught. So, when her window opened suddenly from outside, she had to slap a hand over her mouth to muffle the scream. Braken pulled himself through the small window, grunting and sweating. He finally stood on his feet in front of her, his expression tight. "It's a difficult climb," he whispered, then unspooled a rope he'd carried with him. She watched him tie it to her wooden bed frame, testing it several times to make certain it would hold her weight. "This should make things easier." Lena poked her head out of the window to look down. Her room was on the 3rd floor, and there was nothing between the window and the ground but stone wall. "Handholds are hard to find," Braken told her when she pulled her head back in. "It took me near 10 minutes to make it up the wall because of that." Lena was surprised. 10 minutes was an eternity to someone with Braken's speed. He flicked the rope out of the window, then sized her up. "You go first," he said, looping the rope around her waist and tying it tightly. "I'll keep a hold of the rope to make certain you don't tumble to your death." "If I was going to die today, it would have already happened," she said with a grimace. Braken touched her cheek where a bruise was forming. "Torva had no mercy, I see." He let out a curse, his scowl in no way detracting from his handsome features. Lena swung the cloak onto her shoulders and fastened it. With Braken's help, she managed to lower herself backward out the window, her feet scrambling for purchase on the stone wall below her. She closed her eyes, willing herself to focus and to relax. Braken began to lower her, and she released the windowsill so she could grip the face of the building. Her fingers found a grip, and Lena realized that she didn't need much, only about 1/8 of an inch to keep herself in place. She moved lower, tugging on the rope for slack. Braken grumbled above her, telling her to slow down, but Lena felt confident that she could make the climb. She zipped lower, coming to a stop again when the rope ran out of slack. Impatient, she held on with one hand while the other nimbly untied the rope around her waist. "What are you doing?" Braken exclaimed in a harsh whisper. "Climbing down," she replied, then proceeded to scramble down the wall in less than a minute. She landed on her feet and smiled up at him, feeling triumphant for the first time in a long time. "I should have done this ages ago," she told herself. "Who knew it would be so easy to escape?" She looked around the alley where she ended up, but it was deserted at this hour of the night. Waving up at her companion, she motioned for him to head down. Braken frowned, then pulled the rope back up and fastened it around his waist. Then he began the painstaking process of lowering himself out of the window and climbing down. It was strange for Lena to see him moving so slowly, given that he was usually the quickest Fae she'd ever seen. Finding herself growing impatient, she leapt at the wall and climbed up it at a rapid clip until she was level with him. "What in the 17 hells do you think you're doing?" he said roughly. "Giving you the encouragement you need to trust yourself. Going down is easier than going up." "You're ridiculous," he said through gritted teeth as he continued to make slow progress down the wall. "Come on," she said, teasing him now. "I can do it one-handed." Braken wasn't pleased to see her dangling from one arm. "Knock it off, Lena, or so help me. I'll use this rope to tie you up when we reach the ground." "Only if you can catch me," she said with a laugh, then clambered back down again. When Braken was finally on solid ground, he rounded on her. "How can you be so foolish? You could have fallen and cracked your head open." "Unlikely," Lena said, then leapt up to kick off the wall and tumble into a backflip. "I've got skills." Braken gave her a wry laugh. "I have to admit you do. Still, I don't like to see you take risks." "Life is all about risks. That's what I'm learning. Now let's go. It's already late, and I can't waste any more time." She took off at a rapid clip, making sure to keep her eyes trained for any signs of life around the academy. Guards were posted only at the main entrance, and then more for show than anything else. Anyone stupid enough to risk breaking into the academy would have a horde of Kingsblade on their hands in moments after all. When the academy was out of sight, they reached an intersection. "Down here," Braken said, jerking his thumb over his shoulder. "There's an inn where we can hole up and wait until morning." "No," Lena said, shaking her head. "Someone will find out that I've escaped eventually, and then we'll have Kingsblade and military breathing down our necks. It's now or never." He frowned but nodded, following her when she started up the incline toward the first set of stairs. Lena moved quickly, but Braken kept up easily. They sprinted in silence, both on the lookout for any signs of peril. It wasn't long before they stood at the top of the zigzag steps that led to the highest road in the capital. Moments later, they stood in front of the gate at the Chimera Mansion. A light burned over a small guardhouse set inside the gate, and a liveried guard came out, demanding that they state their business. Braken pulled a gold-plated badge Lena had never seen out of his pocket and flashed it at the guard. "Official business. We need to speak to the homeowner immediately." "Do you know what time of night it is?" the guard replied crabbily. "Apologies for waking you from your nap," Braken replied in a derisive tone. "And yes, they do teach us to tell time in the military, among other things. Now, are you going to open the gate, or do I need to come back with the rest of my unit and open the gate for you?" "Fine," the guard said, yawning. "Be sure to tell Old Man Chimera that I put up a fight." "Will do," Braken said with a salute as they walked through the gate and up the path to the imposing front door. "I can't believe that worked," Lena whispered, looking over her shoulder. But the guard was already back in the guardhouse, sitting with his head leaned against the wall and his eyes drifting closed. "I didn't know soldiers carried a badge." "They don't," Braken replied. "I pinched this off one of the royal guards. I figured I'd need a little more authority to get inside the gates." Braken reached for the bell pull when they arrived at the front door. He pulled it, and from inside the massive house they heard the soft chime of bells. A few moments later the door opened. Lena looked down to discover a halfling in livery gazing up at them.
"Yes?"
The gold badge was back in Braken's hands again. "We have an urgent message for the Lady Lynetta. May we enter?" The halfling's eyes widened in surprise.
"Is the lady in some sort of trouble?"
"No," Braken said, "but the message is quite urgent."
The halfling stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Lena took in the luxurious entry hall, her eyes popping at the display of unmitigated wealth. Even Malvo, the ostentatious fake, hadn't lived in such excess.
"Follow me, please,"
The small man said, toddling forward. He led them into a sitting room and exited, closing the door behind him. Lena walked over to inspect what she thought was wallpaper, but when she got close enough to touch it, she realized that it was, in fact, hand-painted. The entire room was painted in an intricate design out of gold leaf with a glittering substance. "What is this?" she asked, picking at one of the larger pieces of glitter. "Crossed diamonds, more than likely," Braken said, venturing over to the window and pulling back the drapes to look outside. "Diamonds?" She shook her head, amazed at the opulence. The room was decorated with expensive vases, priceless art, and plush furnishings. Lena was almost afraid to touch anything, lest she accidentally ruined something that could not be replaced. It took a few minutes, but finally the door opened, and in walked a woman of such beauty that Lena's eyes almost hurt to look at her. Her platinum blonde hair was bound up in intricate braids that were pulled into a tight knot behind her head, exposing ears that could have been sculpted by a famous Fae artisan. Her eyes were the light blue of a spring sky, her skin the color of cream. She was tall for a female, but delicate, and the scent of lilies followed her. "I was told you have a message for me," she asked in a voice melodic enough to be birdsong. "We do, milady," Braken said lightly and bowed deep, then paused, glancing in Lena's direction. Lena, however, still stood frozen, unable to take her eyes from the noblewoman. "I know her." It was the first time someone had felt familiar since she'd woken up with no memory of her own identity. Lynetta turned to make eye contact, blinking away sleep, then started. Without hesitation, she rushed forward to drag Lena into her arms. "You're here!" "I am," Lena mumbled, unsure of how to respond. The hug was warm and strong, and she felt warmth spreading through her insides. "I know her, and she knows me." At last, one piece of the puzzle that was her past was falling into place. "I'm so pleased to see you. I was so worried when—" Lena felt the noblewoman stiffen when the door behind her opened. She released Lena and stepped back, her face a sudden blank. Lena's eyes flicked to the door to see a handsome man enter the room. "Well, what have we here?" he asked jovially. Lena noticed then that he wasn't Fae. An off-worlder. Here. "My darling," Lynetta said, her face melting into a simper. "I'm so happy to be able to make this introduction." She turned in Lena's direction. "This is Adelina, my daughter." The world rocked around Lena at the noblewoman's words, but it was only the first time. "And this, lovely daughter, is my fiancé, Vel." Lena stumbled backward, her knees hitting a small sofa. She sat down hastily, the room seeming to tilt. "I have a mother, and she's getting married." Chapter 15. Vel grinned widely. Turning to the halfling, who was waiting just outside the door, he called for tea and biscuits. "Please, sit," he said to Braken, gesturing at the spot next to Lena. He then took his fiancée's hand and lifted it to his mouth, kissing the back of it before leading her to a set of armchairs that were positioned next to one another, across from the sofa. "This is turning into an exciting evening." Lena attempted to steal her features, hiding her amazement at the turn of events. Although she was delighted to know she had a mother, there was something about the situation that made her wary. It's been a hard lesson, learning that one needs to earn your trust, she told herself. Rather than reveal her memory loss, she preferred to get the lay of the land before making herself vulnerable in that way to what was essentially a pair of strangers. She looked at the noblewoman, who sat primly with her hands folded in her lap. Lena suddenly wished they were alone, that they could continue the reunion without an audience. She waited for her mother to speak, but it was Vel who led the conversation. He fixed Lena with a warm smile. I've heard so much about Linetta's adopted daughter. I'm pleased to finally meet you." Adopted daughter. Once again, her world was tilting on its axis. For a few precious moments, she thought she'd found her people. She tried not to dip into despair. She may not have birthed me, but she welcomed me nonetheless, Lena reminded herself. "I apologize for the subterfuge," Braken said, bringing Lena out of her thoughts. "We weren't sure of the kind of welcome we might receive." Linetta nodded, while Val looked at him with interest. "It is rare to find Fae taken in by families they have no relations with, after all."
"It is rare," Linetta said with a graceful smile. "But from the minute I saw her, her little face smeared with dirt, wearing a collection of rags, I knew I had to take her in."
"You have such a kind heart, beloved," Val said, patting Linetta's hand.
"You were so young," the noblewoman said softly, staring into Lena's eyes. "And you were wild, practically feral." The beauty laughed, and Lena was surprised to see the joy in her face. "Not like any Fae I knew. That's why I kept you out of sight, out of court. You were on your own for so long. You did not understand how to act among polite company."
"Ah, yes, the famed Fae decorum," Val said. "The gods forbid you tread outside the bounds of politeness."
"We were working on etiquette and protocol. Have been for years, actually," Linetta said. "Little Lena was growing into an attractive young woman and was learning how to groom herself and make appropriate conversation."
A memory hit her suddenly. It was hazy but strong enough for her to believe it was true. She saw her younger self seated at a vanity in front of a mirror. Behind her, Linetta stood, gently combing her hair, telling her to make sure to brush 100 strokes a day. Lena picked up a lock of hair with a shaking hand and drew her fingers through it, starting to count in a whisper. The activity made sense now, as did the feeling of calm it brought. Linetta nodded encouragingly, filling Lena with warmth.
"I had hopes to introduce her at court this year, perhaps find her a suitor."
Linetta's gaze moved to Braken. She appraised him and must have liked what she saw.
"Has my wish come true?"
Lena blushed, her eyes shifting to the floor. Braken gave a polite laugh of his own. "We have not known each other long, but I'm glad Lena continues to tolerate my presence." Vel let out a belly laugh. "I like you, young man." His eyes turned to Lena. "A foundling child, surviving on her own. Just exactly how does someone manage that?" Lena couldn't remember how she'd managed, so she pasted on a smile and shrugged in a way she hoped he would find charming. She was grateful when Linetta spoke again.
"She was self-sufficient, more than any child should have to be. Lena was quick, strong, and smart. She was also set in her ways, so teaching her how to function in society took longer than expected." Another polite laugh. "Years longer." "One does not become a shining beacon of civilization like you are overnight," Vel said, "especially if she was on her own for as long as you say. I'm curious, though, how you managed to avoid the wilds while simultaneously not being found by someone else."
Lena wondered the same thing.
"The wilds weren't always so active," Braken pointed out. "Only in the last decade or so have the incursions increased."
The Velix's expression was earnest.
"As someone who is not native to the Fae Realm, I'm surprised you're familiar with the wilds." "Oh, I'm familiar with many things, Fae and otherwise."
Vel leaned back, bending one leg and resting it atop his knee.
"I'm a wanderer of the web, so to speak. Your realm has always fascinated me, but I'd never had a chance to visit before now."
"We met off-world,"
Linetta supplied. She looked at Lena, a small frown on her beautiful face.
"After the night you disappeared without a trace, I hired a demon tracker I found in one of those less reputable taverns near the Eastern Gate. He insisted that you'd been kidnapped and smuggled out of the realm. I accompanied him off-world, and when the tracker left me high and dry, Vel came to my rescue."
"We chased down a few stray leads," Vel finished, "but to no avail, so
we return to the Fae Realm. Your engagement is the talk of the town, Braken noted. It must have been a whirlwind courtship. Lynetta beamed.
You could say that. She glanced at her husband-to-be. Vel can be quite charming and persuasive.
The moment I saw her, I knew I had to have her, Vel admitted. She stole my breath, my heart, and my wanderlust. I hope to settle down and spend the rest of my life in the service of the lovely Lady Lynetta.
Lena's spirits were high. The way that Lynetta and Vel looked at each other, the sweet things they said, made her pleased to know that happiness still existed.
It is fortunate you found one another, Braken said softly, especially since it seems Lena was never off-world to begin with.
Lynetta turned, her brow furrowed. I couldn't be sure, but you're here now. My heart is overflowing with joy.
And my mind overflows with questions. Braken leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. Why were you so far south when Lena vanished? What were you doing in the hours before you realized she was missing?
Vel's smile melted.
I'm sorry. I don't believe we've observed the proper introductions. From your uniform, I'd say you were a member of the Fae military. Low-ranking, in fact. Are you here in an official capacity? I'm a friend, Braken said. I'm only attempting to connect the dots.
It's all right, beloved, Lynetta said, patting his hand. I had taken Lena south as sort of a test run. I wanted to bring her to court after King's Day, but I knew it would be a trial by fire if she didn't have practice before then. My family has an ancestral estate in the Southlands. We were to attend a country dance hosted by one of the best families in the region. I knew conventions would be more relaxed in the countryside. A country dance. It made sense, since she'd woken up in a fancy dress. So, what happened then? Why can't I remember? 3 sets of eyes turned in her direction, and pressure to speak weighed heavily on her. I can trust her. Of course I can, she told herself. The noble woman had taken her in, welcomed her, tried to help her fit into society, and it's evident that she trusts him. Maybe it's time to make a leap.
Did you make it to the dance, milady? Braken asked, turning back to Lynetta.
She shook her head, her braids slightly swaying. We did not. I'd left Lena to get ready, and when I returned to her room, it was empty. I did not see her again until this moment.
And where did you get to, young lady? Vel asked, a little sharpness entering his tone. You gave your mother no end of worry.
I don't know. The admission burst from her like water from a dam. The simple statement released the deluge, and her story was soon spilling from her.
I have no memory of who I was and what I was doing before the morning I woke up in the wilds in a fancy dress wearing this ring, she said, waggling her finger to display her ring of nobility. And a coin pouch was beside me with your name embroidered inside it. You don't know, Lynetta said, concern heavy in her tone.
Lena shook her head. I wandered into the closest village. Thankfully, Braken met me there and escorted me back to the capital. He's been helping me to trace down my identity. Since you're the only lead we had, we sought you out the first chance we got.
Oh, how horrible for you, Lynetta said, clutching her chest. For us both. I thought you were outside the realm, and meanwhile you were looking for me here.
My loss of memory isn't the only issue. Tears sprang from her eyes. I'm afraid I'm wrapped up in something terrible. There's a woman. She's me except for the eyes. And speaking of eyes, the Hellspawn says my memory loss is some sort of a curse from someone horrible and powerful. The Kingsblade say I have magic in me, and even the king himself suspects me of treachery. She knew what she was saying didn't make sense, but she couldn't stop the words from flowing. Braken leaned in, putting an arm around her. Calm down, he said quietly. Now was not the time to lose it. I want to tell them everything, she cried, wiping at her cheeks. I need to. Her mouth opened to spill the entire sordid saga, but her words were drowned out by the pounding of a fist on the front door,
followed by the sound of raised voices. Everyone froze, and Lena's heart jumped into her throat. No, not now. Not when I was so close.
Chapter 16. The door to the sitting room burst open, and the halfling attendant went flying, stumbling in and falling to his knees on the rug. A white-haired Fae barreled in directly after him, having flung himself through the door before the halfling had finished opening it for him. "You!" the man bellowed, pointing a bony finger at Lena. She recognized him immediately as the stranger who had accosted her at the King's Day feast. Her face went pale, and she leaned into Braken, perturbed by the interruption. The halfling scurried out of the room. She heard his footsteps rushing toward the front door. "My house is in chaos, and it's all your fault!" Spittle sprayed from the old Fae's mouth as he bore down on Lena. Braken sprang to his feet, interposing himself between them. "Father, please!" Lynetta stood, clutching a silk handkerchief she'd used to dab at her tears during Lena's outburst. "Father?" Lena looked at him, noting the family resemblance. It was obvious to everyone in the room that the Chimera Patriarch was not pleased to find Lena in his sitting room. But why? Why is he so angry at me? "I want her gone," he shouted. "She's been a distraction you don't need. You should have been focused on remarrying, on solidifying this family line with real Chimera blood, not wasting your time on this foliage-ripping foundling." Lynetta gasped. "Father, language!" Her fiancé climbed to his feet, tugging on his vest and trying on a conciliatory tone. "Despite the distraction, your daughter has managed to attract a match," he said gently, though Lena sensed the steel beneath his pleasant exterior. "We should go." Braken bent to speak directly into her ear. "Whoever was pounding the door off the hinges is likely someone we don't want to see." Lena's eyes widened. She was so close to discovering the truth about herself. "Please, we can't go now." "We have no choice." He eyed Lord Chimera, who was bellowing at his daughter, reminding her of every disappointment while she looked on, a stoic expression on her stunning features. Footfalls from heavy boots marched up the hallway, and Lena knew they'd be in the doorway in the next few moments. Vel came up behind her, putting a hand on her shoulder. "I'll show you a way out the back, but you need to hurry." Filled with frustration, Lena set off after Braken. Vel waved them through a small door on the opposite end of the room, which led to a narrow set of stairs. "For the staff," he announced, then led them up one flight and into a long, narrow corridor. "There's another set of stairs at the end of this hall that goes to the kitchens." Braken grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her behind him as quickly as her feet would allow. Vel was no less speedy, taking the stairs at a leap and rushing into the expansive kitchens. "The back entrance is through here." He pointed to a nondescript wooden door. Braken opened it, releasing her hand to step slowly out into the night. "Stay here. I'll make certain no one is lying in wait." Lena stood panting in the doorway, adrenaline pummeling her insides. Vel stood across from her, traces of regret on his handsome face. He raised a hand to touch her arm in a gesture of comfort. The moment his hand touched her arm, pain flashed through her. The image of gnashing teeth in a hideous drooling mouth blinded her, and she cried out, falling back against the door. Vel released her, his face full of confusion. "How interesting. I didn't expect that to happen. Did you?" "What are you?" She managed to spit, her voice full of fear laced with disgust. "I'm hungry," he said, the area around him darkening. His face took on a sinister cast. "Oh, so very hungry. But this world will keep me sated for a long while once I've devoured it." He took a step toward her, and Lena opened her mouth to scream. Then Braken was back. He grabbed her arm and pulled her out the door, hurrying her down the walk and to a small gate in the stone wall behind the house. Lena looked back over her shoulder in shock to see Vel standing there, watching her retreat with a smile on his face. They stopped in an alley down the street, Braken blocking her body from view while simultaneously scanning the area for hints of danger. He peered back at the Chimera estate, then dropped out of sight of the street. "Kingsblade," he said like a curse word. "Though how they knew you'd be there, I have no clue." "They are magic users," she reminded him. "I'm sure they have some magical means of tracking if they want to find me badly enough." She was shaking, her tone distracted. "I can't stop thinking about that grinning mouth." A name appeared in her mind. The Eater of Worlds. The monster the Eye had warned them about was here, in the Fae capital.
He's engaged to my adoptive mother, and a mother I didn't know that I had. How much more messed up can things get? We need to go. Find somewhere to hide. Braken was more frantic than she'd seen him, his disposition alternating between anger and worry, and he doesn't even know the worst of it. Where can we hide from the Eater of Worlds? She asked, her tone verging on panic, her eyes vacant. What are you talking about? He said, distracted. He started down the alley on the lookout for another exit that would take them away from the heights. And by the way, what was that back there? He asked, turning back. You started babbling like a crazy person to two virtual strangers. Have I taught you nothing? You're not listening to me. The words came out louder than she meant, building to a near scream and setting off a trio of ravens that had been sleeping in a tree at the end of the alley. Braken's eyes widened. He held his finger to his lips, then scurried back, putting an arm around her and walking her briskly away. You're liable to wake up half the neighborhood, he whispered, his expression black. Lena planted her feet against the cobblestones, bringing them to a halt. Braken, you don't understand. I saw... Her words cut off as a strange sensation overtook her. A flash of white light blinded her, and as she blinked, she realized she wasn't seeing through her own eyes anymore. All around her were trees, dim in the very first light of the day. What in the realms are you doing, Lena? Braken didn't bother hiding his exasperation. We need to move. She blinked, the world coming back into focus. Wait. She put a hand to her forehead, then concentrated on her breathing. Lena, if you don't move your backside, I'm going to pick you up and carry you out of here like a sack of grain. His characteristic anger was boiling over, prompted by his fear of being discovered. The forest was back, and Lena's stomach dipped like she was falling. Don't fight it, a voice whispered in her mind. Lena dropped then, hitting her knees against the cobblestones, but ignoring the pain. The juxtaposition of two worlds, the alley and the treetops, were at war inside her. Rather than lose the contents of her stomach in the alley, she closed her eyes and let the vision overtake her. Dawn's rosy fingers were creeping toward Xaria, as seen from the distance. She found herself standing on a wide tree branch, looking north toward the capital city. Come, now, the voice said. Braken! She croaked, reaching out to him. She's near. She's calling me. She who? He wrapped his arms around her. I'm right here. What's happening to you? Come to me. Come to the wilds beyond the city. Lena blinked away the trees, but they kept coming back as the woman who looked like her called to her mind over the miles between them. You must come now. That's it. She felt Braken lift her gently in his strong arms. They moved forward, but in her mind she could hear the bird calls that came with the dawn. I'm getting you out of here. Her stomach rebelled, the movements of his carrying her making the vision of the city through the trees wobble and shake. Please, stop moving, she ground out through clenched teeth. What in the realm? Lena, we're going to get caught here in this stupid alley because you won't let us leave and you won't communicate. Come now. I will, she called back in her mind. Now let me go. I will not let you go, Braken growled back. Not you, she said, then blinked as the forest image faded and the alley returned. Who in the realm else are you talking to? Braken shook his head. You're making me lose my mind, Fae. Sorry, she said, then grimaced. Please put me down. We can go now. Fae females, he muttered, grabbing her hand and pulling her to the end of the alley. Chapter 17. He made her wait at the end of the alley while he checked to make sure they were still alone. He turned back, motioning her forward, then went rigid when a familiar voice called out to them. Lena! Braken! I found you! Braken turned around slowly, clutching his chest. Pigeon? He said, his measured tone offset by the disturbed look on his face. Where in all of the 17 hells were you hiding? And what are you doing here? I'm very sneaky, she said matter-of-factly, making Lena crack a smile in spite of herself. The alarm was raised less than an hour ago when Torva found your room empty, save for a rope hanging out the window. She'd come to wake you and start your private class again, but you weren't there. The academy is in an uproar. Why did you risk coming here? Lena asked, hugging her friend. You could be punished. Sometimes it's worth the risk, she replied with a small shrug. I knew you'd be here, so I came to find you, to warn you. They're hot on our trail, Braken said, shooing the women forward.
We can celebrate our reunion later. For now, we need to move." They hurried through the quiet streets, the dimness giving way to morning's light as they went. "There," Braken said, pointing at a nondescript cafe on the corner of a narrow street. "We can talk things over away from prying eyes." They were the only customers inside. Lena noticed as they filled a booth against the wall. "Good morning," a cheerful off-worlder popped up with a bright white smile in his rugged face. "What can I get for you?" He rubbed his hands together, shifting his weight while they looked over the menu.
"What sort of drinks are these?" Pigeon's nose wrinkled. "What's a latte?"
"It's pronounced latte, actually," the man said. "And good choice. We grind our own espresso beans in-house after we roast them just dark enough to release the flavor. You can choose between oat, cow, or goat milk, and we'll steam it and mix it with our special dark espresso." "What realm are these from?" Lena asked, confused by the words the server was saying. "The realm of Seattle, milady," he said with a small bow.
"I have no idea what he's saying,"
Pigeon said blankly, turning the menu over and then setting it down in frustration.
"Bring us 3 of those lattes, then."
"Right," he said, picking up their menus and scurrying off. Lena ran her hands through her hair, blowing out a breath of frustration. So much had happened in such a short time that she wasn't sure how to process anything. "I need to tell you something," she said, her eyes flicking from Pigeon to Braken. Pigeon straightened, her hands clenched and close to her chest. Braken's green eyes bored into her. Lena took a breath. "I found the Eater of Worlds."
"At Lady Lynetta's house?"
Pigeon gasped. Braken continued to stare, his expression like stone. Lena nodded. "Her fiancé, Vel. He was handsome, charming, everything you'd want in a man, even if he was from off-world. But when he touched me, something happened. I saw the gnashing teeth in that horrid mouth, just like I saw on King's Day." She shivered, rubbing her arms as she continued. "He said he was hungry, but that devouring our world would keep him sated for a while."
"When did this happen?"
Braken asked, confused. "As we were leaving, at the back door." She couldn't get the image out of her mind, sure it would creep out of her for ages to come. You don't understand how it felt. The pain, the pollution. She'd felt the waves of malice radiating from him. Malice and hunger.
"The Lady Lynetta is engaged to an off-world monster?"
Pigeon shook her head.
"And I thought it was hard being a commoner. Those nobles really have it bad."
Braken looked at her in surprise. Then he burst out laughing. He put his head down on the table, slapping the tabletop with his open hand while letting out huge guffaws. Lena shook her head. "He really is losing his mind. That's what happens when you get wrapped up in my melodrama." The server chose this moment to appear, carefully balancing a tray of steaming drinks. "I also brought you some sugar, real and artificial, and some cinnamon and nutmeg, if you like. Or I could whip up some fresh whipped cream for you if you—" Braken lifted his head, his eyes feral. "Put it down and leave," he growled. The server yelped and bobbled his tray, almost spilling its contents. He hastily set it down and scurried away, and Lena had to cover her mouth to hold in her laughter. The hot drink sat untouched as Lena related what had taken place at the Chimera house in rapid detail. She knew that it was only a matter of time before the Kingsblade tracked them down. "Then, when we fled the house and entered the alley, I was overtaken by a vision. I was seeing through my doppelganger's eyes. She's in the forest, south of the capital. She's waiting for us. She told me to come now." Braken's eyes widened. "That's what was happening to you? I thought you were having a stroke. That, or you were being obstinate on purpose." Lena shook her head. "I could barely walk. Her message was urgent, and I think I should go."
"Do you think that's a good idea?"
Pigeon asked. At the same time, Braken stoutly declared, "There's no way in hell's." Lena held up her hand, waiting for them to wind themselves down. "The city isn't safe for me, and I get the feeling that she knows something I don't." "This is insane," Braken said, flinging his hands out in front of him and almost knocking one of the steamy mugs off the table. "Did you ever think it might be a trap she's luring you into?" "Oh no, another trap," Lena said with faux despair. "If the Kingsblade catch me, I'm as good as imprisoned. They're not going to leave a window available to me now that they know I'm a flight risk." Pigeon twisted a napkin between her hands. I don't know, Lena. I'm with Braken. It sounds dangerous.
Staying here is just as dangerous. In case you didn't hear me, there's a literal monster in the city who knows my name, who's marrying my adoptive mother, not to mention an army of magic users who think I'm a threat to the king. And what if I am? What if the block is removed and I turn traitor? What if I'm a weapon they're aiming right at the king? Stop, Braken said, holding up one hand while pinching the bridge of his nose with the other. All this speculation is giving me a headache. If we're playing what if we turn ourselves into the Kingsblade? If anyone can protect you from a monster, it's an army of magic users. I would rather not sacrifice my freedom willingly. Her voice was soft but filled with strength. I know you don't trust my double, but she did save my life after breaking me out of Malvo's bedroom/prison. I would rather take my chances with her instead of Torva the Heartless. If we do this thing, it will be we. You're not the only one abandoning your role. I'll be branded a deserter if I leave the city with you. Braken's eyes were heavy with an emotion she couldn't name. I know it's a lot to ask, and I understand if you can't come with me. She meant the words she was speaking, but at the same time, the thought of doing this without Braken shook her to her core. That's the dumbest thing you've said all day, he grumbled, but she knew he didn't mean the pseudo-insult. If we do this, I'm going. I just want to make sure we're all aware of the consequences.
I'm going too, Pigeon piped up. I'm a Kingsblade cadet, and you've convinced me there is a real threat directed at our king. It's my duty to respond.
You should go back to the academy, Lena countered, knowing she couldn't be responsible for what happened on their journey. Pigeon had led a relatively sheltered life, and whatever awaited them, Lena didn't think her friend was ready to face it. I'm not sure what will happen or how others will view our efforts. You may not want to end up associated with a traitor.
Nonsense, Pigeon said, waving her hand dismissively. This is the most exciting thing that's ever happened in my life. I'm going along for the ride regardless. Besides, my magic might come in handy since you haven't unlocked your own powers yet.
If they exist, Lena said out of the side of her mouth. She looked back and forth between them, torn between her desire to protect them and her swelling gratitude at their willingness to sacrifice their own positions to go out on a limb for her. Thank you, she said, choking up, then moved to grab their hands and squeeze them.
There's just one little problem, Pigeon pointed out. How do we get outside the city when every Kingsblade, soldier, and guard are going to be looking for us?
I think I know a way out, Braken said. Lena could tell it was costing him to admit that. There's a secret exit, known only to smugglers and thieves. I might be able to get us out that way, but it won't be without its own set of dangers. What is nowadays? Lena said, acting more glib than she actually was. Braken cocked an eyebrow at her, and she winked at him. It sounds like we have a plan, lady and gentlemen.
Nothing to it but to do it, as father would say, Pigeon chimed in, lifting her mug and holding it out toward them. To being really stealthy.
Lena followed suit, lifting her own mug. To escape. Braken shook his head once and lifted his mug. Clinking it against theirs, he said, To a pair of crazy Fae females who are leading me to my doom. They brought their mugs to their lips, taking a long draw from the liquid inside. 3 identical grimaces appeared on their faces, and in tandem they spit out the liquid, spraying the table with latte. Their proprietor ran up, grabbing his hair and pulling in distress.
That's the most disgusting thing I've ever tasted,
Pigeon said, then grabbed a napkin and dabbed at her tongue. Braken pulled out a small canteen and took a long drink of its contents. Lena groaned, then grabbed a napkin and started blotting at the mess. Just go, the proprietor said. Please. They stood up and left, heads bowed over stooped shoulders. Outside the door, they doubled over in laughter. Chapter 18. The secret exit Braken knew was little more than a hole in the wall behind a run-down blacksmith's forge that looked like it had been closed for a century. They were in a part of the capital Lena had never seen. I never expected there to be a place like this in Ixaria. The city had seemed pristine to her, but every palace must have a seedy underbelly, it seemed.
We're supposed to crawl through here, Pigeon asked with a sniff. I'm not sure I'll fit if it gets much tighter. It widens outside. This is just the entrance, and it's meant to be missed." He'd cleared away the dead brush that served as cover to reveal a section of brick that had been removed. Now he went to one knee, threading his fingers together. "Who wants to go first?" Pigeon looked at her, her brown eyes wide and full of fear. "That would be me," Lena volunteered, placing her foot in Braken's hands to boost herself into the hole. She managed to fold her limbs inside and shimmy forward, only to realize that the hole was no longer than 1.5 feet, and after that she could put her legs out and stand. Her plump friend struggled to fit inside, but managed to contort herself enough to push out of the hole and into the wide space beyond.
"What smells in here?" she asked, pinching her nose closed.
"A rodent probably died," Braken said, and Pigeon let out a squeak and used her magic to create a small ball of light. She flung it upward, where it stuck and hovered a few feet above their heads. Lena looked around, her nose wrinkling. "Smells like it's something bigger than a rodent." "Let's move so it isn't us that ends up stinking," Braken said, hurrying them along. "We're within the city wall now. This uneven path will let us out around the corner from the west gate. We'll have to risk being in the open as we cut across to the road south." Lena fell in step behind him. Looking around her, she took in the moss-covered walls and dampness. The tunnel was strewn with trash and random belongings. Nothing expensive, but trinkets that had belonged to someone who cared for them once.
"How did you find this place?" she asked.
Braken didn't turn around to answer her. "I was born in the capital, spent most of my life here. There isn't much of this city I don't know." It wasn't a complete answer, but she respected his desire not to explain. There were many things the Velix chose to keep to himself. He's almost as mysterious as I am, but by choice. She wondered what it would take to get the handsome soldier to open up to her. Now isn't the time for flowery thoughts, she chastised herself. Just look at where you are. After a half-hour of twisting tunnels that had gone up and down, back and forth, Braken led them to a dead end and pointed to a ladder. "Up there! Just push through the tangle of vines and you'll find yourself outside." Once again Lena went first. She found the vines a challenge, and by the time she'd extracted herself from them, her arms were scratched up and her temper was flaring. She helped Pigeon navigate by holding some vines aside for her, saving her the scratches. Braken popped up last, rushing through so that Lena had no time to help him. "Let's go. No time to waste. We need to make it to the south road before it gets much lighter." They set off across the open field, the sun gaining altitude in the sky. It took precious minutes working their way through the tall grass. By the time they reached the gravel that marked the edge of the road, there was already some traffic headed toward the city gates. Braken waved a wagon past them, scowling. "We're too visible out here. We should stop at the next farm, find a place to hole up until dark."
"We can't stop," Lena disagreed. "She's waiting for us. Besides, it's only a matter of time before they hunt us down. The only chance we have is keeping our momentum going now while we still have some element of surprise. If we stop, they'll find us just like they did at Lunetta's."
"Are we even sure they were there for us? Couldn't they have been there for another reason?" Braken's face was filled with doubt. "Running now makes us a target."
"We're already a target."
Lena refused to waste any more time. She rushed onto the road and started striding south, moving as fast as she dared. She was relieved when she saw Braken and Pigeon follow. They made it about a mile before they saw a shower of sparkles explode in the sky above them. Lena started, her mouth falling open. "What was that?" "A warning sign courtesy of the Kingsblade," Braken answered wryly. "We need to pick up the pace, ladies."
"It's too late," Pigeon cried. "They're coming out of the gate now, on horses."
Lena turned back and started into the distance. The city looked miniature from this distance, but she could barely make out the figures kicking up dust just outside the city gate. "Run!" she hollered, then took off like an arrow released from her bow. Lena scanned the road ahead, noticing a curve in the road that strayed close to the edge of the forest. That was the point she needed. Braken moved abreast of her, his face grim. "We're never going to outrun the horses," he shouted. "We only need to make it to there," she yelled back, pointing to the entrance to the forest nearest the bend in the road. "Are you out of your mind? We're not going into the wilds," the Velix was adamant. Pigeon panted behind them, struggling with the breakneck pace.
"Did you say the wilds? Like
The actual wilds?
Yes, she said, and we don't have time to argue. She looked back, then grimaced. They're gaining on us. The crook in the road was nearing, and Lena knew it was going to be a race to the finish. Will we make it to the forest before they can reach us? She told herself that they would, putting every ounce of energy she had in pushing herself to the limit. Pigeon lagged behind, huffing and puffing, but Braken dipped back to move behind her, pushing against her to propel her forward. Come on, you! We're not losing you. We might need you sooner than expected.
We're not really going into the wilds, are we? Pigeon called, her voice high and thready.
Yes, Lena insisted. She's in there. We're going to find her, and we're going to make her talk. She'd become increasingly convinced that her double had information they desperately needed. This time she wouldn't let the woman escape so easily. She wasn't so unsure of herself anymore. Experience in combat training had made her more secure in her skills. I'm coming for you, lady. The sound of hoofbeats echoed in her ears. She could hear the shouts of the men and knew they had only moments to make it to the forest before they were captured. Off the road now! She lunged off the gravel and into the grass, lifting her legs as high as they could go. As fast as she was, Braken, as always, was faster. He pushed Pigeon to the limit, pulling abreast of Lena and putting a hand against her back. Picking up speed thanks to his strength, they rocketed towards the tree line. Here goes nothing. They plunged into the woods, ignoring the thorns and nettles as they moved at speed through the underbrush. Lena couldn't spare a glance backward as she concentrated on not slamming into a tree trunk or tripping over a root. She couldn't hear the sound of the horses or shouts of the men over the crash of the underbrush and the pounding of her own blood in her ears. The brush thinned out, and she hurtled out into a clearing of tall grass and meadow flowers. Pigeon was right behind her, and she slammed into Lena's back as Braken propelled her from behind. Lena tumbled to the ground, rolling twice before landing on her back with an oof. Pigeon let out a cry as she hit the ground beside her. Braken, however, managed to remain upright. He swiveled around, watching their back and waiting, his chest heaving with the effort he'd expended to get them all here. They didn't follow us into the wilds, he said, after several moments of silence. They stayed on the road. Lena lay staring up at the sky, the tree line making a ring around the blue so that it looked as if the sky was held by a green bowl. She breathed heavily, exhausted by their flight.
Did you say we were in the wilds? Pigeon asked, her voice shaky. The actual wilds? Because things happen in here. Not so good things.
It's all right, Lena said, raising herself up to rest on her elbows. We're going to be okay. Her words did little to calm her friend.
There are beasts in the wilds, big ones, mean ones. They come out of the shadows of the tallest trees to snap you up and swallow you whole.
Braken scanned the clearing, his muscles tense. Lena could tell he was on high alert. Pigeon continued her recitation of the dangers of the wilds.
People into the woods and never come out again. Lots of people. Old people, young people, even children. Some people think there's a witch who lives inside an ancient tree, and she eats any children that wander into the wilds.
Braken came over and offered his hand, pulling Lena to her feet. What now? He asked, ignoring their companion. Now we find her, my doppelganger. Where is she? He asked, looking around. I'm not sure from here. I was expecting to get farther on the road. When I see through her eyes, the view is similar to the one I saw on our last night before entering X area. I thought I'd make it to that point, then enter the wilds if we had to. Braken sighed. How quickly our plans have changed.
I know you've heard the rumors, Pigeon said, fidgeting with her robes as she spoke. The forest is swallowing people whole. People who aren't even passing the borders of the wilds. The forest is coming for them. Coming for whole villages even.
The way she was speaking reminded Lena of a prayer almost, or a religious litany of some kind. Pigeon's face was anxious, her movements jerky. Her fervent tone gave Lena the chills. You've got to calm down, she told her gently, patting her arm. We're going to be okay. Besides, all of the rumors about the wilds can't be true, Braken said, his voice ringing with certainty. Everything always ends up eaten. That's the thing about rumors. They don't make logical sense.
Lena let out a gasp as a sudden streak of green and brown descended from the canopy to land behind Braken. Pigeon screamed, falling on her backside, while Braken jumped, caught off guard. He whirled around to face their assailant. There she stood, radiating fierce pride, her appearance so like Lena's that it made the scene seem surreal. Her double sashayed up to Braken and smiled. "Guess what, city dweller? The rumors are all true." Chapter 19. Braken had his rapier out in a flash, the sunlight glinting off the jewel blade. Because of the Fae race's natural allergy to iron, it was outlawed in the realm. Fae swords were made of jewels instead, making them both expensive and lethal. His was pointed at the woman's throat. Lena pushed past him, driven by the need to confront her double. "I came," she said, holding up her hands. "Now, maybe you can tell me why I keep seeing through your eyes. At first, I thought it was only in dreams, but I definitely wasn't asleep earlier. How are you doing this?" "I thought it was the same," her double admitted, her eyes wary. "I thought they were dreams. But when it kept happening, when I kept seeing what that woman was doing to you, I knew it was more than a dream. Those things were happening." Lena sniffed, crossing her arms over her chest. "You saw that, huh?" Her doppelganger nodded. "You survived it. That means you are strong." Her gaze strayed to the others. "An interesting crowd you run with. I can understand the male. He's trained to kill, and he isn't difficult to look at. But the other one confuses me." "She isn't helpless," Lena countered. "I've seen her skills at the academy." "A magic user," her double said, giving Pigeon an appraising look. "That makes sense." "What are you doing here?" Braken asked, losing patience. "Why did you call Lena into the wilds? What exactly is your plan for us?" "I never called you soldier man," she snapped back. "She is here because it is time for her to be here." "Oh, great," Braken said, throwing up his hands. "Another lover of riddles. Why doesn't anyone just say what they mean?" "He has a point," Lena said quietly. "Why did you call me now?" "Seeing things through your eyes. It was always in dreams until last night. I almost fell out of a tree a few hours ago, and the image of a gaping maw filled with teeth into my mind, accompanied by a dose of searing pain. I've never experienced anything like it. We need to alert the crone. Tell her what happened." Lena blinked. The crone? The image of a wrinkled and stooped woman cackling over a cauldron filled her mind. That must be the woman I've seen in my dreams. "Who is she to you, this crone?" "She is many things," her double said. "My teacher, my mentor, my leader. She will need to hear of this. Whatever that thing is, it represents a danger not only to city dwellers, but to all Fae." "You keep calling us city dwellers," Braken said, confused. "Does that mean there are other Fae? Ones who don't live in cities?" Her double's head turned slowly, her expression filled with confusion. "What's this one's deal?" she said, jerking her thumb at Braken. "It seems like maybe your military isn't recruiting the best and brightest." The revelation they'd just received was earth-shattering by the looks on both Braken's and Pigeon's faces. "It's not possible," Pigeon said softly. "Fae that live in the wilds? But how?" "Wildlings live in harmony with nature. We don't have to subvert it or control it. Everything we need, the wilds provide." "Where is the crone?" Lena said, bringing focus back to the situation at hand. Although she could appreciate the momentousness of the moment, she refused to be distracted from her quest for information about herself and the plot surrounding her. "I'm being selfish, but only because this time I am the conspiracy somehow." "She is in her hut, many leagues from here." "Deeper in the wilds, I suppose." At her double's nod, Braken let out a curse. "We can't go any leafing deep, Adelina," he said, his tone insistent. "We should stick close to the edge of the forest, close enough to follow the road. We'll make our way south, find somewhere to regroup." Lena shook her head. "I have to do this. I know it's risky, but I'm caught up in something that will pull me into its vortex, whether I'm deep in the forest, at its edges, or outside it. I might as well go into this on my own terms." Her double nodded in approval.
Then we go. Lena put her arm around Pigeon's shoulders. I know how terrifying this is. You can go back to the city now, turn yourself in, say I ensorcelled you. No one will doubt you, and you'll be safe. Pigeon shook her head. Don't get me wrong, it's tempting, but friends don't abandon friends when their need is greatest. Lena smiled and pulled her in for a hug. Thank you. And you, soldier, her double said, are you going back to the city? Braken sent her a scowl. I have a name, and it's Braken. What do they call you, or do wildlings not use names? Her doppelganger laughed, shaking her head. I like a man with a little spice in him. My name is Sigilla, but most call me Gilly. Funny, you don't look like a Gilly, Pigeon said, falling into step beside her while they made their way across the meadow toward the trees on the other side. On the contrary, what should a Gilly look like but me? She has a point there, Lena said, then laughed. They were in the gravest danger they'd ever faced, but somehow it didn't feel like it. At least you aren't named after a bird known for being fattened up and eaten, Pigeon said, and began regaling Gilly with a story about her father and his penchant for giving out nicknames. Lena moved closer to Braken, who was walking silently, his expression lost in thought. We've been in the wilds for almost half an hour now, she pointed out, and we have yet to be eaten. I failed to see the humour in your sardonic comment, Braken bit back, and Lena was taken aback by his vitriol. She could see now that he was keeping the tightest rein on his temper, but his control was fraying. I don't like this one bit, and I just want to register my strong opposition to this plan. Look, I know you're scared, so am I, he stopped suddenly, putting his hand on her shoulders. I just don't understand why you want to rush into danger like this. From the moment I've met you, you've jumped from one crisis to another. Sure, a lot of this is driven by circumstance, but when it keeps happening, one is forced to wonder whether you are really such a victim of fate. His words stung, but Lena could see the truth in them. At first, I was driven to find out who I was, to uncover my identity, but the further I go, the more I feel this compulsion to unravel the mystery that seems to surround me. I'm caught up in something big, I can feel it, and if I don't find the strength to hunt for answers, then more people are going to end up hurt instead of just me. It's my job to protect you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I'm afraid that I can't. Not here. That's okay, she said, smiling up at him. This time, I'll protect you. Braken grinned in spite of himself, and they shared a moment of laughter. His hand moved to cup her face, his thumb gently stroking her cheek. The intensity in his eyes stole her breath away. He leaned in, his eyes flicking to her lips and staying there. Oh, bless the realm, he's going to kiss me. Everything inside her went haywire, every speck of her attention focused in on his lips, inching their way toward hers. But it was not to be, because her doppelganger once again showed an appalling lack of timing. Why don't you two lovebirds build a nest later, she grumbled. We're never going to make it to the crone at this pace. Lena backed away, blushing furiously. She pretended to be interested in Gilly's movements, watching as the woman drew a small clay pipe from inside the collection of homespun fabric and animal fur that comprised the wildling's attire. She lifted the pipe to her lips and blew, her fingers moving in a rapid rhythm. I don't hear anything, Pigeon said, moving to stand beside them. Neither did Lena, but in a few moments she picked up the sound of hooves. Her chest tightened, and she was afraid that their pursuers had risked the wilds after all. Hide, Braken hollered, propelling her and Pigeon behind a large treetop. But it wasn't men on horseback who burst through the brush around them. It was 3 deer, 2 large does, and a buck with a majestic pair of antlers. Your mounts await, Gilly said, gesturing toward the trio of wild deer. You expect us to ride those things? Braken's expression was incredulous. You ride horses, don't you? She replied, shrugging. Why not these? For one, you're missing saddles, and for another, these beasts have never been trained. They respond to a sure rider and the commands of the pipe. She gestured for them to climb onto the creatures.
Would you prefer to stand around and debate all day, or do you want to get where you're going in a quarter of the time it would take to walk there?" Braken moved toward the deer, but not without some grumbling. He approached the buck warily, keeping his eyes on the sharp points of its antlers. The animal stood docile, letting out a lone snort before it allowed the Velux to approach. He reached its side, then began to stroke it, attempting to calm it. "Climb aboard," Gilly told him. "We haven't got all day." Braken took a deep breath, then pulled himself onto the beast's back. It gave another snort, but did not attempt to dislodge him. "I think it might be safe," he admitted, and Gilly repeated his words in a mocking tone under her breath, just loud enough for Lena to hear it. "I'm beginning to doubt your taste in men." Lena eyed the wildling, then took a step in the direction of one of the does. She watched Pigeon do the same with the other female deer. She was able to leap high enough to swing a leg over the creature, but saw that Pigeon was struggling to do the same. Gilly put the pipe to her lips again, and the remaining doe bent her forelock, the reduction in height allowing her companion to climb onto the creature's back at last. "What about you?" Lena asked her double. "Don't worry, I'll keep up." Gilly lifted the pipe to her lips and blew through it. Lena again heard nothing, but the deer shot off, leaping toward the tree line in graceful gallops that had her holding on tight. Their speed was amazing, especially on the uneven terrain in the forest with its endless obstacles. They leapt over, sped under, and moved around everything that got in their way without once slowing down. Lena held on for dear life as they raced into the forest, the creatures now springing between trees and jumping fallen logs. Despite her fear of losing her seat, there was something exhilarating about their breakneck speed and untrained grace. She thought she might prefer the deer to horses, as they were certainly more maneuverable. She looked to her left to find Pigeon with her arms held fast around the doe's thick neck, her eyes shut tight. Smothering a laugh, she glanced right to find Braken smiling with abandon. "It looks like I'm not the only one enjoying the ride." There was a rustle in the treetops above her, and Lena craned her neck to see what had made the noise. Her jaw dropped when she saw Gilly running full tilt down the branch of the large tree beside them, her bare feet never once losing purchase as she ran as quickly and nimbly as the deer Lena was riding. If she can do that, what match would a soldier be against her? Lena had thought Braken was the quickest Fae she'd ever seen, but now she was forced to revise her opinion. The same question circled her mind. Who is this wild woman, and why does she look like me? Chapter 20. The sun had set hours ago, but still they rode onward, driven by Gilly and her magical silent pipe. Pigeon's balls of light chased after them as they rode, providing enough light to see by, although apparently neither the deer nor Gilly seemed to need it. Lena forced her bleary eyes to remain open, her body numb from riding for so many hours. Above her, Gilly continued to keep pace, never once slowing as far as Lena could tell. Her double swung from vines, leapt from branch to branch, and scrambled up and down trees like she was born in the canopy and not on land. It was incredible how fast the wildling was, but at this point, even looking at Gilly was making her tired. She was filled with relief when a few minutes later Gilly leapt among them, the pipe held to her mouth. The deer slowed until they were walking sedately to a small pool beside a thicket. Lena slid off the creature's back with a gasp of gratitude. She rubbed her backside, wondering when the feeling would come back. The deer continued on to the pool without their riders, dipping their heads to drink greedily. Lena walked over to Gilly, who was scouring the ground in front of her for something. "We need a rest," she told the woman simply. "No time," Gilly said, then dropped to her knees when she spotted a clump of fan-shaped yellow mushrooms. She gathered some up, tucking them in a hidden pocket inside her breeches. Then she plucked another one, handing it to Lena. "Eat!" Lena watched as the woman popped a mushroom into her mouth, then sniffed at the one in her hand. Nothing screamed poison, so she placed it in her mouth and chewed. The flavor was robust and earthy, but not unpleasant. Gilly handed her a few more. "Give them to your friends. These will provide a little burst of energy." "I'll share out the mushrooms, but I really must insist that we get some sleep." A yawn interrupted her, but she continued. "We had zero sleep last night,
And we've been rushing all day and half the night. We can't keep going like this forever. Gilly stared at her, then let out a long breath. You can get a few hours sleep, but that's it. The crone expects me back before the next sunset, which means we're going to have to really push it to make it on time. Thank you, Lena replied, surprised at how giddy she felt at the thought of a few hours' sleep. She rushed over to where Pigeon and Braken were stretching. We can rest for a few hours. You rest, Braken said. Someone needs to stay alert and on guard. You've been awake just as long as we have, Lena told him. Besides, Gilly will keep an eye on us. I'm not sure she ever sleeps. Braken pressed his lips together until they were nothing but a narrow line. I don't think I should leave us to the mercy of a woman we barely know. One who has already told us to believe the rumors that everything and everyone that enters the Fae Wilds gets eaten. Lena put her arm on his shoulder. Braken, you're exhausted. So am I. If you keep going like this, you're going to get hurt. It's time to trust that, for once, not everything is out to get us. Fine, he grumbled, throwing himself down onto a patch of springy moss. Once again, I get overruled. He crossed his arms and rolled over, putting his back to her. Lena wrapped herself in her cloak and settled in beside Pigeon, who was already snoring away. The moment her eyes closed, she fell into a deep and dreamless sleep that wasn't interrupted until she felt the sensation of something hovering above her, poking at her throat. Her eyes opened, and Lena scrambled backward suddenly at the sight of a spear point pressed against her neck. Don't move, a gravelly voice said. Lena froze, then glanced next to her where Pigeon lay in similar fashion. Wildlings surrounded them, their spears no less sharp than those of the city dwellers. Her eyes found Braken, who was scowling in her direction. She didn't need him to speak to read his thoughts, but he mouthed the words anyway. I told you so. Lena's gaze found Gilly, who was in heated debate with several other wildlings. They were all dressed similarly, the odd mishmash of homespun fabric and fur. Despite their attire, they were well-groomed and were not at all what she'd consider a race of feral forest dwellers. Their appearances might pass inspection, but their attitudes, she soon discovered, did not. What is wrong with you, bringing outsiders this deep into the forest? A tall, blond man with broad shoulders lectured Gilly. You know it is against every rule we have. Rules are made to be broken, Jalal, she said lightly, but the crowd around her didn't let her off that easily. They shouted accusations at her, and finally her double had to hold up her hands to quiet them down. I know what I'm doing. She has information the crone needs. You endanger us all by bringing them here. This was from a slender woman whose silver-laced dark hair was cut short and speckled by leaves. The rest of her get-up looked as if a shrubbery had come to life. We have a sacred charge to protect our people and keep them safe from the harms the city dwellers seek to do us. These outsiders must not be allowed into our deepest reaches of safety. I hear you, Gilly said, addressing the woman and the crowd. I know your concerns and I share them, but we are facing a new threat, one that is likely nothing I've seen before. These three are fighting against the same threat. We need their knowledge and maybe their help. The crowd of wildlings around her set off talking furiously to one another at her words. What threat is this that you think we need the help of outsiders? Jalal barked. And how do you know it's not just another one of their nasty tricks? Lena watched the exchange between Gilly and the dozen wildlings who were dead set against allowing her and her companions into their midst. It was strangely like watching herself try to convince Braken and Pigeon to trust her instincts. She felt a flash of sympathy for her wildling counterpart. Grabbing the shaft of the spear pointed at her, she shoved it to the side and stood, glaring at the wildling who held it, and rising to her feet. It's not a trick, she spoke up then, out of a need to help Gilly. She knew Braken wouldn't approve of the trust she was always giving her doppelganger, especially considering what had happened the last time they interacted. But there was something about her, beyond the fact that they looked nearly identical, that told Lena they were connected. She had to trust her instincts on this, because without her memories, everything she did
was on instinct. 12 sets of hostile eyes turned in her direction. She took a few steps forward, adopting a reasonable tone. There is a monster among us, here in the Fae Realm, a monster determined to devour us all. If we don't work together, if we don't stand up and fight him, we all lose, wildling and city dweller alike. The bony woman covered in leaves moved closer to Lena, looking her up and down.
She really is the spitting image of you, she told Gilly, her lip curled in a snarl. I wonder how something like this has happened.
Lena didn't like the way the woman was looking at her double, as if seeing her in a new and much less positive light.
No one is more confused about that than me, Belida, Gilly said. But it doesn't change the fact that what she is saying is true.
The woman scoffed as the murmurs from the others increased again. Lena overheard accusations flying among them, how the city dwellers were the real threat, how destructive they were, how nothing could be worse than the damage they'd wrought over the centuries.
Please,
Lena said, holding up her hands to quiet them.
I know what you think about city dwellers, but I think your anger may be misplaced. If anything, it's the wilds that are encroaching on their lands. I've seen it happen myself.
Who is this woman who speaks as if she isn't a city dweller herself? Jalal growled.
He turned to Lena, his scowl prominent.
Where did you see this supposed encroachment?
In my dreams, she was forced to admit. When they started booing her, Lena tried to talk over them.
You don't understand. My dreams aren't normal. They're more like visions and...
Jeers and hisses drowned out her words, and Lena stopped speaking, grasping that she'd failed to get her point across. Braken approached and put a hand on her shoulder.
These aren't the type of people who listen to reason, he told her quietly. They're out for blood.
Gilly, you must not bring them deeper into the wilds,
Belida insisted.
It's evident that they're lying to you, lying to all of us.
I've always respected your opinions, Gilly said, her voice rising above the fray. And I understand that this is asking a lot from you, allowing them access to our innermost sanctum. But I would not do this if it were not absolutely necessary. Is it not only the blonde one that you need?
This came from an older male who carried a quiver full of arrows on his back, with a bow slung over his shoulder.
Why not take her and kill the others?
The wildlings looked at one another, the murmuring starting again. Lena held her breath, horrified at the option he'd provided. Gilly shook her head.
They are her companions, and I will not have them harmed.
When the backtalk started again, she lifted one hand and closed it into a fist, causing silence to fall.
I'm done wasting time. The Crown has ordered me back before sundown, and we still have miles to go. I will be taking them to her, all of them. And if any of you do not like it, I am happy to settle things by combat.
A hush fell over the crowd. Then one by one they started to fade back into the forest around them until Lena could no longer see a hint of any of the dozen wildlings who had accosted them. The 4 of them were left alone in the clearing, but she had an eerie feeling that she hadn't seen the last of the wildlings who cried out for their blood.
Who were they? She asked Gilly quietly.
They are the keepers, and I am one of them.
She sighed, and Lena saw some of the tension going out of her double.
We patrol the borders of the wilds and keep them safe from city dwellers who would destroy them and us. As a city dweller, I can assure you that we do nothing of the sort.
Braken had moved closer to Pigeon, who was still trembling with fear at their near-death experience.
We didn't even know your kind existed. We all believed the woods were filled with beasts and natural dangers, not a race of Fae who hate us to their very core.
Gilly's eyebrows lifted, and Lena could feel waves of anger radiating from her.
We are not a separate race of Fae, she said, her voice frigid. We are the same race, and we are the ones who were not foolish enough to abandon the bounty of the wilds, to live in cold stone boxes and dig lines into the land to grow subpar food. We are not the ones who scraped the land clean of all traces of our past to build a society of rigid convention and idiotic rituals. We are not.
Lena could see her getting worked up and moved forward to touch her arm gently. I know this is hard for you, just as it is for us. But if we're going to defeat our common enemy, we have to work together. I'm still not convinced your kind isn't the more dangerous enemy, Gilly said, her voice low and intense. I will risk the condemnation of my people, and if I am wrong, I will face my punishment. But I will not act as if we are friends when we do not know each other. What's the punishment for allowing city dwellers into the wilds? Pigeon asked softly, having recovered slightly from her terror. The only punishment that matters. Death. The words hung heavily over the clearing. It was a sobering fact. What Gilly risked, what they all risked. Lena felt her skin break out into goosebumps. She was suddenly worried about what they might find when they were brought before the crone.
Chapter 21. We walk from here. Gilly swung down from the branches above them, dropping in front of Lena and helping her to dismount from the doe. They'd ridden through the day until the shadows of the trees around them began to lengthen. Sunset was near, the deadline the crone had established for Gilly to return to her before the old woman had known she'd be bringing back outsiders. Nerves filled Lena as she and Braken helped Pigeon climb to the ground. Gilly stood with her hands planted on her hips. What you will see is something no outsider has seen in many generations. You will remember that you are a guest here and not a welcome one. Follow the rules, and you won't be hurt. Disobey, and I cannot be responsible for what happens. Lena swallowed hard, the full realization of what she'd led them to do falling on her shoulders and weighing them down. Gilly turned and headed into the thicket before them, an area of thick growth that had Lena huffing and puffing to pass through. Gilly made it look easy, so Lena attempted to follow her, stepping where she stepped, moving as she moved. It helped, but the passage was still far from easy. Finally, they stepped out into a clearing just as the last red rays of the sun were hitting the roof of the small thatched roof hut in front of them. It looked ancient, like it was the first dwelling a Fae had ever built. She could see a pair of rooks roosting under an eave, and a small grey mouse scurried up the side and disappeared into a hole when Lena stepped on a branch and broke it.
What is this place? Pigeon asked, her voice filled with equal parts wonder and trepidation.
The crone's hut, Gilly answered simply, then stepped forward, heading down the path where the grass had been walked away to nothing over the ages. Lena followed, an unfamiliar feeling welling up inside her. I've been here before. She didn't know how she knew it, but the certainty that she'd seen the crone's hut before was akin to the feeling she'd had when she learned her real name. That certainty did nothing to decrease her anxiety. If anything, it ramped it up until she had to ball her hands into fists to keep them from shaking. Gilly reached the old wooden door that was riddled with small holes and imperfections, much like the hut itself. She raised her hand and knocked twice, then took a step backward. Lena watched as the hut's door opened on its own accord, the disquiet inside her growing. Gilly turned and motioned for her to approach. When Lena was close, Gilly put a hand on her back and propelled her forward into the hut. She did the same for Braken and Pigeon, then entered herself, closing the door behind her. The hut was warm, lit by the fire that was crackling at one end of the room. Smells assaulted Lena, scents that she could not name, but that she somehow recognized. From the rafters hung all manner of dried plants and flowers. There was a small table with 2 chairs, several shelves filled to the brim with moldering scrolls and odds and ends that Lena didn't want to look too closely at. A long wooden table was piled high with bits and pieces of forest life, toadstools, animal bones, fresh and dried leaves, a wicked stone knife with a sharp edge. Not far from the table sat a large cauldron seated in a row of stones. It bubbled away with no discernible method of heating. And there, in front of the cauldron, as Lena had seen her in her dreams, stood an ancient woman. She was muttering to herself, stirring the cauldron and tossing things into it in a seemingly random fashion.
My hair's standing on end, Pigeon whispered. What is this place?
At the cadet's words, the old woman turned to look at them. Her eyes latched onto Lena, and she froze, then let out a cackle of delight.
At long last, you return.
Familiarity overwhelmed Lena. She knew this place somehow, knew the old woman standing before her, and it wasn't only in her dreams that they'd met. There was something strange at play, something that resonated inside her when she looked at the crone. The old woman sized her up as well, coming forward to walk around her in a circle.
Well, it seems you've adapted to your new life quite well. Just look at that posture, regal as a queen's, and your hair, so well groomed. She returned to face Lena. Very refined, like a proper lady. Gilly laughed, then drawing Lena's attention away from the crone. A proper lady? Are we looking at the same thing? Her hair is streaked with leaves and twigs. Her clothing is stained from our journey. I may not know many proper ladies, or any in fact, but I'm pretty certain they don't look like her. The crone ignored this, instead moving to Lena's companions and looking them up and down. Unexpected guest, she said, rubbing her hands together in a way that made Lena nervous. And look at me, so unprepared. Lena wasn't sure how to respond, and the waves of familiarity of being here before were giving her déjà vu. Her gaze moved to Braken, who was standing with every muscle tensed. He was waiting for something to happen, ready to spring into action, as if surrounded by danger. We are surrounded by danger, she realized. She'd seen the crone's power in her dreams, but she didn't know what she could do to ensure their safety. And what we're facing is even worse. She had to find a way to win the crone over to their side to face off against the evil that lurked in the capital city. There is something you should know, she started, but wasn't able to finish when the crone waved her hand as if shooing a fly. That line is for me to say, the crone said with a toothy grin. But for now, there is too much to prepare. You should rest because you're going to need all your energy for the ritual. Ritual? Gilly asked, her brow furrowing. What ritual? The crone didn't answer her question. She picked up a handful of herbs and threw them into the cauldron, then picked up a paddle and stirred the mixture. Take them to get some rest, she said instead. You're all going to need it. Lena knew a dismissal when she heard one. But you don't. Gilly held a finger to her lips, then held the finger out in front of her and rotated it. Lena let out a sigh, then turned around and headed out the door after Braken and Pigeon. We do need to rest, Braken said quietly. And it wouldn't hurt to regroup a little before we start trying to convince these folks to join our cause. I agree, Pigeon said. We're looking at the mother of all uphill battles here, she pointed out. I could use a good meal and a warm bed before we start trying to convert our enemies into friends. Lena doubted the wildlings were ever going to accept city dwellers as friends, but she kept her thoughts to herself. The three of them fell in line behind Gilly, who started off down the path away from the hut. The frost had grown darker around them, but the moon was nearly full and peeking through the treetops, providing enough light to see by. The path wound through the trees, and they traversed a small creek by walking on a series of stones that had been placed there for that purpose. Shortly after, Gilly came to a stop. We're here. Here? Lena said, gazing around and noticing no change in the forest around them. Where's here? Gilly laughed. Here is where we will rest tonight. Pigeon let out a sigh. So much for a warm bed. Lena looked around in confusion. There's something here. Something that I'm missing. Her eyes followed the line of a large tree, then flitted to another tree nearby. There was something slightly different about them, but she couldn't put a finger on it. Then the bark on a nearby tree started to move, and a person appeared, dressed in the characteristic mix of a homespun fabric and animal furs. Lena's eyes widened. There's a door in that tree. Suddenly something clicked in her brain, and she could see what had been hidden only a moment before. It's a city, she murmured. A city in the trees. It blended in so well she could have easily passed it without realizing what was actually here. But now her eyes could make out the openings in trees where doors had been built and windows had been created. Lena leaned her head back, looking at the canopy where walkways were built along ancient branches.
Bridges made of vines were woven into the growth, connecting trees when branches couldn't. Here and there she noticed wildlings going about their business, but all were giving them a wide berth. "They aren't used to outsiders," Gilly explained, and Lena laughed. "That's putting it mildly." She let out a low whistle. "This place is amazing." It also felt familiar, like the crone's hut had. "I've been here before." "What are you two looking at?" Braken asked, his brow furrowed. "I don't see anything but trees and more trees." "Follow me," Gilly said, ignoring his questions. "I'll find somewhere for you to bed down." She set off in the direction of an old tree with red bark and pine needles. Lena set off after her, motioning for her friends to follow. "What's she doing?" Pigeon asked when Gilly stepped up and raised her fist to knock on a tree. The bark seemed to peel back of its own accord, revealing the pinched face of a young woman with curly brown hair. "I wasn't expecting you tonight," the voice said, although its tone was pleasant. "The crone give you the night off?" "I need a favor, Cressy," Gilly said, then moved to the side to reveal the three of them standing behind her. Cressy's eyes widened comically, and she hurried to slam the door, but Gilly managed to get her foot in to stop the door before it snapped shut. "Come on, Cressy. They're harmless." "Stone lovers," the young wildling croaked. "Road builders, farmers." "What's wrong with farmers?" Pigeon asked, confused. "It's talking," Cressy yelped, starting to tremble. "Oh, now, don't be ridiculous. You know they can talk." Gilly gave her friend a winning smile. "They need a place to stay tonight. And since your brothers are on the coast gathering provisions for winter, I know you've got empty rooms." "Absolutely not," Cressy said. "Me hosting city dwellers? Are you trying to get me killed?" "The crone knows about them," Gilly said. "They're here for a reason." "I'll be a pariah," the curly-headed wildling moaned dramatically. "Oh, woe is me." Gilly ignored the other woman's dramatics and pulled her door open, waving Lena and her friends through. Lena entered, surprised at the spaciousness inside the tree. Steps carved into the wood circled the walls, leading to a series of platforms that supported the floors above. The layout was a little strange, stretching vertically instead of horizontally, as she was more used to seeing in the city, but it was still cozy and functional. "Food," Pigeon said, then slapped a hand over her mouth. She gathered her composure, then apologized to their unhappy hostess. "I'm sorry, it's just that we've ridden all night and day, and I'd only stashed an apple and a handful of nuts in my robes before we left, so it's fair to say I'm practically starving by now, and I couldn't help but notice the roast pigeon on your table and—" The plump cadet's stomach rumbled as if on cue. "Give them some dinner," Gilly ordered. "I've got to see to a few things. I'll be back in the morning." Cressy's face registered her panic. "You can't just leave them here." Gilly ignored her and shot back through the door. The hostess ran to the door, yelling out of it, "You're cursing me, you realize that, don't you?" When she didn't get an answer, Cressy slammed the door behind her. "I can't believe this is happening. Gilly is out of her acorn-loving mind." She froze when she saw 3 sets of eyes on her. "Right, food." She twitched, shaking her head. "Just, help yourself to whatever you want on the table." The wildling seemed afraid of getting too close. She moved closer to the wall, fidgeting and talking softly to herself. "Well, you heard the woman," Braken said, moving toward the table which, in addition to the bird, had a bowl full of fresh roasted vegetables and a half loaf of home-baked bread. "Might as well fix a plate." They ate quickly, their hunger getting the better of them. Lena's eyes kept flicking to their hostess, who kept her eyes averted. "We truly are outsiders here," she thought, frowning. She was realizing how difficult it would be to sway sentiment to their side. Although she knew they didn't belong in the wilds, there was a part of her that disagreed. The part felt very at home inside the tree-trunk-cum house. The feeling these opposing sides brought her was strange and disorienting. It was hard to concentrate on their dinner, despite how hungry she was. By the time Cressy showed up the stairs, pointing out the empty bedrooms that belonged to her absent brothers, Lena was weighed down by exhaustion. The moment her head hit the surprisingly comfortable mattress, she fell into a deep sleep. Chapter 22. Her stomach and nose conspired to wake her early the next morning. With her eyes still closed, Lena started to sniff the air. Something smelled delicious, so she sat up and opened her eyes. It took her a moment to remember where she was. The small bedroom inside the trunk of a large tree belonging to Cressy and her family was comfortable, with homey touches that made her a little jealous of the wildling who got to sleep here every night. She was wiping sleep from her eyes as she exited the bedroom and headed down the stairs. She ended up in the second bedroom, meaning she had to climb past the room Pigeon was borrowing on her way down to the ground floor. Lena knocked on the door, but the room was already empty. Scanning the main floor as she descended, Lena frowned to see that it too was vacant. The coals in the small stone fireplace were out, and the table was barren. The smells still filled her nostrils, but it was clear they weren't coming from inside the tree. So she opened the front door and ventured out in search of breakfast. She found Pigeon and Braken a few paces away, looking at an open space among the trees where a few fires had been built to roast meat and vegetables. A loose circle of wildlings were gathered around tables that had been set up for communal dining. The wildlings' eyes were on the outsiders, their faces the opposite of welcoming. "Something smells divine," Lena said, pausing next to her friends. "What say we get ourselves some breakfast?"
"You know me," Pigeon replied. "I'm all for eating, but I'm not sure I want to risk getting my head torn off in the process."
"We aren't welcome here," Braken added, a dour expression on his face. "We should go." "We can't leave yet," Lena countered. "We have to tell them about the Eater of Worlds." She didn't like the way the wildlings were looking at her, their expressions ranging from outright anger to barely veiled disgust. "We've got to make a start somewhere." Taking a deep breath, she set off toward the tables. Lena picked up a plate and started to fill it, smiling at the people gathered around the table. Most avoided her eyes, but a few stared back in shock or irritation. Braken followed her lead, but his reception was much different from hers. Hostility had some of those gathered murmuring angrily. Before he could touch any of the food, a contingent of wildlings moved to confront him. "How dare you wear that uniform in our presence?" Lena recognized the speaker. It was the tall man Gilly had called Jalal. Braken shrugged. "I'm a Felix. It's the uniform I've earned." "Earned by taking the lives of defenseless wildlings," another man said. His scruffy beard and untamed hair gave him an unruly look. "Earned by laying waste to our homelands." "I haven't laid waste to anything," Braken replied, stiffening. "My only duties are to serve and protect." A peal of derisive laughter went up from the wildlings. Belita pushed her way to the front of the group, her eyes filled with righteous wrath.
"You lie," she hissed. "You and your kind are responsible for endless atrocities. Remember Allura?"
she asked her companions. The word sent shockwaves through those gathered in the clearing, and Lena felt a trickle of unease forming. "I don't know what that is," Braken said, but his words went unheard. Murmurs of "Remember Allura" went through the crowd. "Many wildlings were lost without a trace at Allura," Jalal said, his voice solemn. "We will never forget their names."
"It is thanks to you," Belita said, thrusting a finger into Braken's chest. "You and your kind, that they are no longer here to speak for themselves."
"How dare you show your face here?" someone cried out in the crowd, followed by another voice who shouted, "Revenge for Allura!" The call was picked up and repeated until it became a chant. The wildlings who surrounded Braken began closing in on him, causing the Velix to put his hand on his sword. Lena considered pulling her dagger from her boot, but she was worried about upsetting the delicate balance that hung between them. "Please don't let there be blood spilled here." "Enough!" Gilly dropped from above, directly into the path of Jalal and Belita. "Back off!" The wildlings weren't pleased at the interruption. Words were thrown back and forth, violence becoming more likely as the seconds passed. Finally, Gilly put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled. "I said enough." She stared down the crowds. "The Crone says they are not to be touched, and they are under my own protection. If anyone harms a hair on their heads, I will seek you out and even the score. Mark me." A ripple of fear went through the crowd. A few shuffled away, while others backed off a few paces but remained vigilant. Even Lena found herself intimidated by Gilly. The wildling woman was fierce. She was the most athletic person Lena had ever seen, and she did not doubt the woman's fighting prowess. She would be a fearsome enemy. "Let's eat," Gilly said, jerking her head in the direction of the table. "Sit." Lena could see Pigeon debating whether to obey, her eyes bouncing from the crowd to Gilly and back again. Her stomach growled and hunger won out. Soon the four of them were sitting together at an empty table. Gilly picked up a large and mean-looking knife and stabbed it into the tabletop, then filled her plate as if she didn't have a care in the world. Pigeon soon lost herself in her offerings on display.
"The food may be rustic, but the ingredients are the freshest and most flavorful I've ever tasted."
Lena speared a mushroom with one of the wooden utensils scattered around the table and placed it in her mouth. Flavor exploded on her tongue and she smiled. "My favorite." Freezing, Lena's brow furrowed. "How do I know these are my favorite? I don't remember ever tasting them before." She turned to Braken to ask what he thought, but hesitated when she saw his dark expression. His eyes relentlessly scanned the wildlings around them. She took his hand and squeezed it. "You should eat." He ignored her, focusing his attention on Gilly instead. "What is Allura?" "Allura isn't a what, it's a where," she replied, then bit into a carrot. When Braken continued to stare, she sighed and continued. "Allura is a region to the north, not far from your capital city. 200 years ago, city dwellers burned it to the ground, but not before building blockades around it, ensuring that none of my people were able to escape. 119 wildlings died in that fire. Women, children, men who wanted to defend them but were helpless." Lena's heart sank. This was exactly the kind of conflict that they had to put aside if they were going to defeat the coming threat. "This can't go on, one side hitting the other hitting back. We're all Fae, the same race as you pointed out. This endless civil war is senseless." "Our kind did not start it," Gilly said, "but we will finish it. The time is almost at hand now. The time for revenge." The food turned to ashes in Lena's mouth. She set aside her utensil and stared out at the faces surrounding them. They could have been any faces in a crowd in Nick's area. There was no difference between them physically, but they were worlds apart culturally. "It was a mistake to come here," Braken said, almost low enough that she didn't catch it. Lena felt her stomach knot. She'd been trying to see this as a selfless act on her part, risking her life to help the Fae overcome the evil menacing their realm. But it was beginning to feel more and more like a selfish attempt to save her own skin at the expense of people she cared about. It doesn't feel good to know they're risking everything for me, and I don't even know who I am. The world around her faded, and Lena sank into the blackness of her dark emotions. Pity, shame, and guilt circled around her insides, making tiny cuts that multiplied with every pass, cutting her guts to ribbons. Everything inside her screamed that this place was familiar. She stared across the table to where a woman who looked just like her was calmly chewing. "I've been willfully blind. What if this is my home, and the woman sitting across from me is my relation? The people around me are my people? That would mean that whatever this block is, it's keeping me from knowing which side I'm on. When it's gone," Lena shivered suddenly, not wanting to think about the very thing she'd been obsessed with since she'd woken up without her memory. Braken tried to warn me, to force me to think things through, but once again, I ran at the first person who presented an opportunity for answers. Last time it got me locked in Lord Malvo's bedroom, nearly enslaved to the false nobleman. How will it end for me this time? Pigeon's spirits were improving with the addition of food. Soon her friend was back to talking, the stream of consciousness overflowing the table.
"Your mentor mentioned a ritual tonight. Is that something that happens commonly here? We have our own rituals of sort, going back millennia, but They're extremely formalized, so much so that some of their significance has been lost to time.
My mentor? Gilly said around a mouthful. You mean the crone?
Pigeon blushed. It seems impolite to call someone that. Is that really her name?
Shrugging, Gilly continued to eat. She's likely forgotten her own name, so long has she trodden this forest. I believe you're evading the question, Braken said, his bow low. She wants to know about the ritual.
Yes, I do, Pigeon said. You see, I'm a cadet of the Kingsblade, the most elite magical force in the realm, and...
Gilly let loose a snort. Most elite in the realm, eh? Color me impressed. You're saying there's another force that's more skilled in the use of Fae magic? Lena didn't like the look in Braken's eyes or the harshness of his voice. I don't suppose you've ever heard of the Winking Hand, but then again, a day ago you didn't even know the Fae lived in the wilds.
The Winking Hand? Hands can't wink?
Pigeon bit her lip in confusion. Precisely, Gilly said, pointing a fork at the plump Fae. They can do the impossible. Where is this Winking Hand, then? Braken looked around them in exaggerated fashion. Maybe we could get a look at them, since you're so forthcoming. Oh, I don't see any. How strange. His anger was no longer just simmering under the surface. It was spilling over, making his motions jerky and his voice strain. Lena squeezed his hand again, willing him to calm down. But Braken was a slave to his temper. He stood, his expression stark. You look down your noses at us, while at the same time accusing us of atrocities when you yourselves have committed worse. The truth is, we don't hide ourselves away and plot. You've seen our cities, beheld our fighting forces. Why do you insist on being so mysterious? I'm sorry we aren't eager to show our hand, Gilly said, her emphasis on the last word, letting Lena know she was making a pun of sorts. And hiding from yourselves is still hiding. Why do you think it is that no one in the city remembers that Fae live in the forest? Are you saying they've willfully forgotten? Lena was taken aback by the implication. That we don't want to remember you, or that we can't? Gilly shrugged and Lena's frustration skyrocketed. She borrowed from Braken's aggression, standing to lean over the table toward her double. You say now is the time for revenge, but I say now is the time for answers. Why keep things a secret now? Can't you see that all this only keeps us distracted, only fuels the division between us? Gilly stood looking down at her from on high, her expression imperious. The division needs no fueling. It's been there for as long as the realm has existed. It's your side who deals in secrets, not ours. She turned away, her eyes scanning the crowd. I've got to help the crone prepare, she announced, loud enough to carry through the clearing. These three are not to be touched, on pain of my bow. Lena watched her stride away, a feeling of foreboding washing over her, like the ice-cold water of an alpine lake. Chapter 23. When Gilly was no longer in sight, Lena was worried that her group would be accosted. Braken had the same idea, because he pushed his plate away and went to stand beside the table, his hand on the hilt of his rapier. Pigeon finished her breakfast, her face taking on a greenish tint.
I think that maybe food doesn't agree with me when my life is in danger.
Guilt filled her, and Lena breathed heavily. She sat down beside her friend, her hands resting limply in her lap. I'm sorry about all of this, she said. I don't know why I thought they'd be able to help us. I haven't even gotten a chance to warn their leader. A leader who is as old as the forest itself, Braken said in a monotone voice. Considering that King Lear still looks like a young Fae in the prime of life, I shudder to think how long ago the crone was pushed out into existence.
It's okay, Pigeon said, putting her arm around Lena. I knew the risks, and you didn't make me come. I just wish I could be of more help.
She turned, picking up 3 wooden mugs and filling them with water from a makeshift pitcher made from a hollowed-out gourd.
How about some nice hot tea? Father says tea is the lifeblood of civilization.
You're always talking about your father. What about your mother? What does she say about tea? Lena had meant the question to be light-hearted, a way to distract them from their circumstances. Pigeon flinched, pausing for a second before pasting on a smile.
I didn't know my mother, she admitted. She died when I was very young.
I'm sorry, Lena said, feeling worse than before. I did not mean to bring up a sensitive subject.
No worries, Pigeon said. The tea will make everything better.
She made a flourish over the water in the mugs, then frowned. She flourished again. Then Pigeon burst into tears. What's wrong? Is it because of what I said? Lena clutched her chest, worried that she'd made a mess of everything.
No, Pigeon moaned. It's my magic. I can't touch it. Can't access it.
She looked distraught, tears streaming down her pale face. What do you mean? Braken asked, his movements jumpy. Lena thought he was on the verge of pulling out his rapier and swinging it wildly at whatever came their way.
I thought I was just too tired last night to call on it, which happens from time to time when I'm extremely exhausted, but this morning it's the same. I tried to heat the water in these mugs for tea and nothing.
Her face was screwed up and she howled. I've been cut off. Lena pulled her in for a hug and Pigeon buried her head in her shoulder and sobbed. It was a desolate sound, and it plucked at Lena's heartstrings, making her feel all the worse. How could I have been so stupid? Every minute that goes by, we find ourselves in greater danger. I've got to fix this, to turn it around while I still can. We need to escape. The words were out of her mouth before she could stop herself. Braken turned his head slowly to look at her. I'm sorry. I must have misheard you. Did you just say that we need to escape? I should have never gotten us into this. I'm so sorry. I thought I was helping, but as usual, I was just tossing us from the stove into the bonfire. Unleafing believable. You are the most vexing woman I've ever met, Braken growled. 1 minute you're demanding we rush into the wild, and the next minute you want to escape, and your timing couldn't be better, now that we're surrounded by hundreds, maybe thousands of enemy combatants deep in their own territory. He looked up at the sky, throwing his hands out in a dramatic fashion. And to top things off, our magic user can't use her magic. Lena forced herself not to hang her head. I admit it, I was wrong, but I'm willing to try to fix this. There must be some way to sneak out of here. We managed to evade the Kingsblade, and they're the most elite force in the realm, remember? More likely they gave us up to the wilds, knowing they would finish us off without the Kingsblade having to lift a finger. Braken grumbled. How right they are. Pigeon pulled away, still sniffling but wiping her tears.
I'm with Lena. If there's a way out of here, we should find it.
Her expression was unsettled, her face puffy from crying.
I can't stand this feeling of being cut off from my magic. It's like not having the use of one of my limbs.
What about Gilly? Braken frowned. If she comes back and catches us, she'll make sure we don't get another chance. I'll distract her. A rudimentary plan formed in Lena's mind. You guys do some scouting around, look for possible weaknesses and escape routes. I'll keep Gilly busy to buy you some time. If you get a shot to escape, just run for it. Leave me behind. Don't be ridiculous, Lena finished Braken's sentence for him. I'm not. I'm completely serious. Braken sat down beside her. Putting a finger under her chin, he guided her gaze to meet his. I've already told you. I'm here to protect you. I won't abandon you. I know, and you don't know what that means to me, but I told you that in the wilds. I will protect you. It's my turn to return the favor. If you can flee, do it. We'll meet again, I have no doubt. She left unsaid that when they did meet again, she hoped they were still on the same side. Braken didn't nod, but he didn't argue either. Lena stood, giving them a wave, and then started off toward the crone's hut to look for Gilly. Her feet seemed to know the way to the proper path, so Lena let her mind wander as she went. She could feel so many opposing tensions inside of her, pulling against one another until she was afraid of being ripped apart. She was loyal to her friends and they to her, but that loyalty put them at risk. She was sympathetic to the wildlings and their desire for a simpler life, one living in accord with nature instead of battling against it. But that didn't mean she wanted to see them overrun the cities either. There has to be a balance, she told herself. A way for all Fae to enjoy the benefits of both worlds without destroying one another. If there was a balance, Lena had yet to find it. She stepped out into the little clearing where the crone's hut stood, looking the same as it had yesterday, the same as it had for a millennia or longer. She saw movement on the north side of the hut and headed in that direction. Gilly was there, sat on a downed log, a curved glass object in her hand. Lena approached, taking his seat on the same log. "What have you got there?" "It's a tool the crone uses in her magic." She held it up for Lena's inspection. "There are a series of lenses inside that reflect the moonlight to focus it, creating a beam of light that can be used as a part of a spell casting." Lena peered at the device, noting the pattern of concentric circles inside, one inside another. It seemed like a gateway to infinity that one could hold in the palm of her hand. "Will she use it in the ritual tonight?" Gilly nodded. "That's why I've got to align the lenses just right." "You're looking forward to the ritual, aren't you?" Lena knew the answer before Gilly responded in the affirmative. "The crone has been waiting for a long time for this moment. She says the hour of our victory is at hand." "Have you talked to her about the Eater of Worlds yet?" The question hung in the air between them for long enough that Lena became concerned. "I have not, but she would not hear me now even if I did. After the ritual, she'll be able to focus on something else. We can tell her then, and—" "You had no intention of bringing me here for that reason, did you?" Lena grasped suddenly. "That was just your excuse to get me to come to you, wasn't it?" The weight of her realization was soul-crushing. "We've been building toward this for years, for my entire lifetime. You're the final piece in the puzzle according to the crone. When I returned to the hut after that night on the rooftop, when our touch caused that explosion of magic, she told me that it was the sign she'd been waiting for. I was to retrieve you, to bring you back to the hut, to her." "Why?" Lena didn't understand. "What am I to you, to the crone, besides some sort of unwitting patsy?" "The ritual will reveal all," Gilly said, as if that fact were self-evident. "Betrayed again," Lena muttered. "Braken was right. I'm a fool who has a knack for trusting the wrong person." "You trusted the soldier," Gilly pointed out. "What does that say?" Lena glared at her. "You tricked me." The woman who looked so much like her sighed. "Do you think this is something I set out to do because it amuses me? Because it brings me joy? Look at us." She moved her hand back and forth between them. "I mean, you're me, basically. Do you think the fact that we're identical in appearance is something I've missed?" "But what does that mean?" Lena's voice was small, the fight draining out of her. She'd been outmaneuvered, outthought at every juncture. "The ritual will reveal all," Gilly said. "And if it doesn't, then we will wait for the crone to tell us the meaning." "You put a lot of faith in this crone," Lena grumbled. "I sure hope she's worthy of it." "She's all I have," Gilly admitted. "She's the only one who has been there for me. She made me what I am today." Lena looked her over, wondering if that were really something Gilly should be celebrating. Whatever this ritual is, whatever answers it might provide, I have the feeling that the outcome won't be positive for me and my friends. She made a decision, then, not to participate, whatever it took. "Ah, got it," Gilly said softly, smiling at the device in her hand. "This should work perfectly." "You're excited for the ritual," Lena said, wondering what her double knew that she didn't. "Why is that?" "Because things are about to change. My people have been waiting for as long as they can remember to reclaim that land that your so-called king stole from us. We've been waiting to undo the damage these city dwellers have done to our realm and restore things to the way they should be. My people need this." "And what about the city dwellers?" Lena said softly. "What do they need?" Gilly spit on the ground at her feet. "They will get what they deserve.
They've been destroying this world, ripping up forests and killing wildlings in the process, leaving no trace of them, not even enough to bury. That ends now." "And what about the villages you've destroyed?" Lena saw Gilly stop, but she didn't deny it. "I could see through your eyes, remember? I saw what you did to those people, to their homes. What traces are left of them?" "They started it," Gilly growled, rising to her feet. "But we are going to finish it." "Don't you see? This endless snipping is what's to blame. Both sides have their faults, which is why now is the time for diplomacy. If we can't work together, then we'll be easy pickings for off-world monsters." "First things first," Gilly said. "The time for the ritual nears, and the crone will need her device." She turned away without another word, heading around the side of the hut and disappearing from sight. Lena watched her go, realizing that she'd failed. And my failure might mean the end of the realm. Chapter 24. Lena had just reached the path that headed back to the Tree City when Braken and Pigeon headed down it toward the hut. They paused when they caught sight of her. Braken's face was black. "This is an impossible task, finding an escape route. We can't even figure out where the city begins and ends. It blends into its surroundings so well."
Not to mention that they know everything so much better than we do. I'm not even certain I could navigate back the way we came, let alone find a new path to the closest village outside the wilds."
Pigeon sighed, shaking her head in frustration. Braken nodded. "We traveled many leagues into the wilds, and getting back out again before their keepers find us seems too much to hope for."
"Especially without my magic to help us sneak," Pigeon looked forlorn.
"That's why you're so stealthy," Lena said, putting two and two together. "You use your magic to help you stay hidden."
"Guilty," Pigeon admitted. "Father says I'm as nosy as two skeletons dancing in a box of bells. Without my magic, I would be caught in moments."
Lena let out a sigh. "The ritual is going to start soon, and if we aren't able to get away, I'm afraid we'll be forced to participate in some way."
"Maybe if we can't run, we can hide ourselves away somewhere until after the ritual is over."
Pigeon looked at the forest around them.
"There has to be innumerable hidey holes in the forest where we could remain out of sight."
"I have a feeling that won't be so easy," Braken said. "They know the terrain much better than we do. We might think we're hidden, but to them, we would probably stand out like a vampire in the daylight." Lena scrubbed her face with her hands. "What are we going to do?" There was no time for either of them to answer, because the door of the hut flew open, hitting the wall with a bang.
"There you are!"
Lena turned her head to see the crone pointing a bony finger in her direction. Her face filled with excitement, her eyes flashing golden in the sunlight.
"All the preparations are ready. Now is the time. Come forward."
Braken stepped in front of Lena, shaking his head. "We're not coming anywhere near you." Gilly walked out of the hut, coming down the path in their direction. Her face was determined, her movements sure and swift.
"Now,"
the crone said, shaking her head with the exasperation of a parent of young children fighting over a toy.
"This isn't the time for arguing."
The crone's fingers shifted until it was pointing at Braken. She flicked the finger forward, and Braken was lifted into the air and thrown across the clearing until he hit the trunk of a large tree and slid down it. Lena rushed forward, but Gilly grabbed her around the waist, stopping her. Braken pulled himself to his feet and drew his rapier. The crone cackled with malicious laughter. Her finger made a small circle, and suddenly roots were bursting from the ground and attacking the Velux. He hacked at them with incredible speed, but the roots were faster. In moments he was held fast, his rapier knocked from his hand. He opened his mouth to shut, but thin tendrils of root filled his mouth, leaving him silent. Lena's jaw dropped, her insides full of cold fear. Her fingers digging into her own face, Pigeon let out a high, keening scream. The crone moved to point at her, and vines unlooped themselves from trees to shoot toward her, wrapping around the girl in grey robes. "No!" Lena shouted, struggling against her double, seeking to help her friends. Gilly was too strong for her, too quick.
She kept Lena held fast, helpless, but to which Pigeon had lifted between two trees and restrained by the vines.
"It's easier this way," the crone said, her tone broadcasting that this was the most natural situation in the world. "Especially since the pudgy one can't access her magic."
"You cut her off," Lena gasped, knowing she should have realized it before. What if she's done the same to me? What if the crone was the one who blocked my own powers and my memories with them? "Get inside," Gilly said gruffly, carrying Lena in the direction of the hut. Lena dragged her feet, attempting to keep herself from moving, but it was to no avail. The crone entered the hut, and Gilly pushed Lena in after her, then entered, slamming the door behind her. The hut was filled with hot, acrid smoke that made Lena's eyes water. She coughed, trying to wave the smoke away, but there was too much of it. She blinked through it, looking at the cauldron that was boiling away in the center of the room. The crone next to it at her table, her finger cataloging the ingredients she'd set out before her. Lena watched as the ancient one picked up a diamond knife, its blade glittering in the firelight. She turned to Lena, moving toward her, and Lena attempted to back away. But Gilly grabbed her by the arms and held her fast. The crone approached, her hand lifting to run her fingers through Lena's hair. Lena trembled, afraid that the knife would end up in her throat. To have come all this way only to be sacrificed for a wildling ritual. What a fitting end to a fouled-up life. But the knife did not touch her throat. Instead, the crone pulled out a lock of hair and sliced it off with a quick jerk. She then reached past Lena to do the same thing to Gilly. The crone returned to her cauldron and flung the locks of hair into the mixture. The firelight flared at the addition, and the color of the liquid in the cauldron shifted from a muddy brown to an electric blue. The crone raised her arms and began to chant, and the smoke thickened, burning Lena's eyes. She couldn't see anything until a sudden crackling sound shook the hut. Lena looked up to see the roof pulling itself apart and spinning into the forest around them. The sky above was exposed, the noontime sun hovering directly over the hut. The chant continued, swelling louder as the smoke filtered out of the room and into the sky, blotting out the sun. The whole sky grew darker, and Lena realized that it wasn't just the smoke. Somehow, day was becoming night. The smoke faded, blown away in the winds that now whipped around the hut. Lena looked up at where the sun had been. In its place, a full white moon now hovered. She gasped and heard an identical gasp from beside her. She turned to find Gilly looking up at the moon with the same rapt expression as the crone. Lena watched as the crone picked up the device Gilly had been tuning earlier. She held it over the cauldron, positioning it just below the moon. The chant changed in intensity, becoming soft, the words almost cajoling. The crone coaxed a moonbeam down to hit the box where the light was reflected over and over in the concentric lenses until a burst of concentrated moonlight came out the end, blasting right into the cauldron. The crone let out a whoop of joy as the cauldron's liquid once again changed color, this time to a vibrant green. The chant swelled again, the old woman's words in a language long forgotten by all but her, echoing off the walls of the hut and seeming to encircle Lena. Her eyes slid closed, and she could feel herself being drawn into a trance. She found herself in a field of wildflowers, the most beautiful and serene place she'd ever seen. Lena was far away from the hut, far away from the capital city, far away from all the strife, fear, and pain. She leaned to smell a purple flower, its sublime scent putting a smile on her face. There was a sudden whisper on the wind, and Lena's brow furrowed. "Open for me," it said, almost too low to make out. Lena ignored it, running her fingers over the soft petal of the flower. Then she felt a scratching, gentle, almost pleasant, in her mind. "Open." Unable to help herself, she did as the voice requested. Suddenly, the flower field was gone. Lena was plunged into darkness. Realizing she could not move, she could not see. The echo of the crone's cackle bounced around the inside of her mind.
"Yes, give me what I need."
Her mind opened wide, outpoured everything she'd seen, everything she'd heard on her journey to Exeria and her trek into the wilds. Every person she met, every building she entered, the Kingsblade, the keepers, the king himself. Every piece of information she'd learned, no matter how trivial, was being gathered up by the crone's long, bony fingers and stuffed into her mind. That was how she pictured it in the void. The crone was plucking out her knowledge and giving it to herself, cramming it into her oversized ears, shoving it into her beady eyes, snuffing it up through her nostrils, swallowing it down with a burp. There was a sudden pause. "What do you have here?" the crone asked, stumbling upon something unexpected. "I don't remember putting this here." Lena felt a sudden crush of pain and let out a scream. "Oh dear, that's in there deep, isn't it?" She could feel the crone in her mind, picking at something, attempting to tear it away. Every poke and prod was excruciating, and Lena felt that if it lasted much longer, she'd be driven permanently insane by the pain. "Just one more." Lena was on the verge of collapse, darkness filling the edges of her vision. "There!" The crone crowed triumphantly as something deep inside Lena unlocked and outspilled everything. Everything she'd forgotten. Everything she didn't know that she knew. All of it tumbled out of her at the speed of light. "I remember." All of it flooded back to her. Questions she'd had unanswered since waking up beside that stream weeks ago were unleashed. But more than that, things that had been hidden from her were revealed, things Lena could barely understand. She remembered the night of her 13th name day, the night she and her sister Gilly had knelt on either side of the crone and drank the potions she'd given them. She remembered waking up the next day on the great southern road outside the wilds with no memory of who she was or how she'd gotten there. She remembered walking down the road, confused, looking for anything familiar, when an ornate carriage had pulled up and an attractive, well-dressed woman had gotten out. Lynetta. That was Lynetta, the moment she found me. Lena remembered it all. Lynetta's estate, where the noblewoman had carefully cleaned her up and fed her. She also remembered the way Lynetta's father had reacted when Lynetta had brought Lena north to the capital. Lord Benchimera did not want some cast-off child in his home. She should focus on finding a mate and having children of her own instead. But Lynetta bonded with me, even though I was not her own. She convinced her father to let her keep me. And then she gave me something I've never gotten enough of, love and affection. The sudden image of a strikingly beautiful woman with thick red gold hair and light brown eyes that flashed golden in the sunlight. The woman held an infant child in each arm, one with pink eyes, the other with eyes of purple. My eyes. Chapter 25. Lena gasped back to consciousness, sitting bolt upright on the dirt floor of the crone's hut. She gripped her head, in a daze. I remember. Everything. All the questions she'd set out to answer were now explained. All the mysteries unraveled. Lena turned her head to see Gilly lying on the floor beside her. My sister! A sudden memory flooded her. She was holding hands with her sister, and they were much younger then. They'd been with the crone for years by then, and had mastered simple magics, including how to disguise their appearances in small ways. Gilly had waggled her little fingers in front of Lena's eyes, and then her own. There, her sister had said with a mischievous grin. Now, no one will know the difference. They'd sped down the path from the hut where the crone had been busy working on one of her concoctions. She tended to forget that anything else existed when she was working, which made it easier for the girls to sneak out. Today, they'd planned to go to the commune and see if they could convince the people there that they were each other. A classic twin swap, Lena had called it, making Gilly giggle. I bet I can convince them all to call me by your name all day. You'll have to work on that walk of yours, Gilly teased. You're me, remember? I don't walk like a fawn with a crooked leg. Lena had rolled her eyes. Well, that means you'll have to remember everyone's names properly. You're me, remember?
I never confuse my fame with my fame. Your me, remember, had become one of their favorite games and inside jokes. They'd masqueraded as the other until they knew one well enough to sometimes forget that they were just pretending. We're sisters, Lena marveled again. I have someone in this world, someone I was closer with than anyone else. An older memory intruded without warning. Lena remembered the woman with the golden eyes, their mother, had brought them to this very hut one night under the cover of darkness. Lena was barely old enough to talk then, and she'd rode her mother's hip, a lock of her red golden hair in her chubby fist. Gilly had been in her other arm, and she'd let out a cry when their mother went down on her knees to set them on the hut's doorstep. "Remain here, girls," she told them, "until you are welcomed in." She'd bent to press a kiss to each of their foreheads, then stood and walked away. They'd spent the rest of the night exposed, waiting on the doorstep as commanded. In the morning, the door of the hut had opened, and the crones stood looking down at them. "You're mine now, girls," the old woman had told them in a rough voice. "I will do what your mother could not. I will make you hard, make you sharp, make you weapons for the cause." Lena realized the truth now, that the pair of them had been trained from near birth to execute a plan which is now fully in motion. She watched her sister pull herself off the floor and hold a hand out to her. Lena took it, allowing Gilly to help her off the floor. Gilly's face had the same dazed look as her own. Lena understood then that she'd had gaps in her memory as well. Both of them now remembered serving the crown until their 13th name day, when they'd undergone the ritual that had blanked their memories of all that had happened to them before the moment they'd woken up. "Why did you do it?" Lena asked, rubbing her head. "Why did you take away our memories like that?" The crone watched her with a closed expression on her face. "You girls were too close, even though I tried to pit you against one another several times. The bond between you two was too strong, so I knew for the plan to work, I would have to blank your memories, make you forget each other. I would send one of you to the city dwellers and keep the other to train with my forces here." "Why did you exile me?" Lena asked. "I woke up on the road, far from the wilds. I was still a child." "You were old enough to handle yourself," the crone corrected. "And it wasn't an exile. It was a scouting mission. That was another reason to remove access to your memories. There was no risk of you exposing our plan if you were caught and tortured." "No one tortured me," Lena bit back. "Except you, maybe." The crone shrugged. "I figured you'd live on the edges of their society. It would be a hard life on the streets, but you'd begin to learn their weaknesses. Then you'd find your way back to me on instinct, and I'd reap the knowledge you had learned. I never figured some well-meaning city dweller would scoop you up and raise you as her own." "That's because you believe all city dwellers are fiends," Gilly said, her voice soft, but with a steel edge. The crone cocked an eyebrow at her. "They are. You know that, girl." She turned her attention back to Lena, a scowl on her face. "You got a little too comfortable in the city," she said. "You were enjoying the life you stumbled into, which meant I finally had to send your sister to retrieve you. But even that did not go as expected." "I don't understand why," Lena began, but the crone cut her off. "Enough of this prattling. We're wasting time. Now that I have the information I needed, we can plan our next move." She beamed up at Lena. "You did exceptionally well. You know their hierarchies, their movements, but most importantly, we know how they think. This is how we will defeat the city dwellers once and for all." Lena's spirits plummeted. She fell to her knees, realizing that her worst fears were true. "I'm a weapon to be used against innocent people, like my friends." She remembered Linetta's kindness, so different from the harsh life she'd experienced with the crone. The ancient woman was right in saying that she'd grown accustomed to her comfortable life in the city. It wasn't so much Linetta's wealth and privilege that she enjoyed, but the fact that the woman had cared for her, had given her compassion where the crone had nothing but festering hate. Linetta had accepted her fully,
had wanted her to be a member of her family. She'd wanted her to start a family of her own, to find a husband to love her, to care for her. That was what had finally gotten Lena to calm down and attempt to learn to fit in. She'd been wild, almost feral compared to this staid Fae nobility. It had taken years for Lynetta to calm her tomboy tendencies and convince her to behave like a noble woman, and I'd been on the verge of being accepted into society, but then Lena tried to call up a memory of what had happened before she ended up on the riverbank with no memories, but it was missing. Her eyes narrowed. "It seems the crone isn't done keeping secrets from me," she wailed on the old woman, her temper exploding. "What are you hiding from me?" The crone's brow furrowed. "What are you prattling on about, girl?" "I still don't have access to all of my memories," Lena griped. "You're still keeping something from me. What is it?" "Nothing," the crone insisted angrily. "The ritual removed the spell I'd cast when you were younger. All of your memories were released." "Not all of them." Lena moved toward the crone, malice in her heart. "Give them back to me." She lunged for the old woman, intending to grab her and shake her, to demand that she relinquish her hold on Lena's memories. The moment she touched the crone, the woman let out a screech. Lena was filled with pain, and the image of a gaping tooth-filled mouth exploded into her mind again. The crone reeled, stumbling back against the table and knocking over some of her ingredients. She pulled herself together and rushed back to Lena's side. Grabbing her head, the crone pulled it down to peer into her eyes. "What is it? What's gotten inside you, girl?" "It's him," Lena whispered, fear flooding her. She'd come into the wilds for this reason, to make them understand that danger waited for them all in Ixaria. But now that she was here, it was hard for her to force out the words. "You've been polluted by your time among the enemy," the old woman nattered. "You need to be cleansed." "Cleansed?" Lena shook her head. "Wait, you need to know something. In the capital there's a man. Well, he's not a man, exactly." The crone ignored her, bustling around the table, putting her ingredients back to right. "You're not listening to me," Lena cried, attempting to draw the old woman's attention back to her. "We're all in danger." "Live long enough, you'll find that danger is a constant," the crone muttered. "Now, where did I put that? There it is." "I'm done," Lena said, remembering how useless the crone was when she had her mind set on something else. "Release my friends. I'm leaving." "Holly, good time," the crone cackled, turning around to face Lena. "For now, it's time to sleep." She snapped her ancient fingers, and Lena dropped to the floor unconscious. Her last thought was the memory of the woman with golden eyes. "Mother, why did you abandon us?" Epilogue. From his position on the dais at the rear of the temple, La could observe the crush of people without being affected by the crowds. The rows were packed to bursting, anyone and everyone among the nobility having come out to celebrate the nuptials of Lynetta Chimera and her off-world fiancé. The stately temple was filled to the rafters with onlookers, with more gathered outside. Even the commoners had turned out to watch the festivities. Crowds of cheering people filled the streets for a mile around them, creating a dull roar that echoed through the stone edifice. Lyle was old, older than the temple, older than the city around him, older than every Fae in attendance. He'd long tired of events like these and preferred to spend his time in solitude, in the sanctuary hidden inside his palace. Too much was weighing on his mind, and it made it difficult to put on his happy face and pose in posture in front of the masses. King's Day was not so long ago, and the events of that night had taken more out of him than he wanted to admit. The evil, foreign presence that he'd felt that night had been powerful enough to dispel his magic temporarily. That represented a threat larger than anyone he could remember. Lai had spent all of his time since that moment attempting to locate that threat. He'd meditated in his sanctuary, sending out his mind throughout his kingdom, seeking to uncover the truth. It was the forest hag, he told himself, his blood heating so that his fingers were digging into the platinum throne where he sat. She has been far too aggressive of late. It's time to remind her to stick to the borders of her homeland. The forest hag and her people were known to him.
They always had been, for many ages. While the Fae around him had died and been replaced, their memories falling away over the eons, Laya still remembered the breaking of their covenant. Allegiances had ruptured, families had split apart, and he'd reacted by carving out a kingdom for himself, one that she could not touch. Not while I draw breath. He didn't like to think of her. It made him irritable, resentful. Sully is not the best mood for which to observe a marriage. Laya turned his thoughts away from the hag and to the activities below him as the officiants began the service. Below him on the dais, the quartet of Fae musicians began to play, filling the temple with a soothing, beautiful melody. The music helped to calm the king, and he managed to smile as he watched the Chimera family and their closest companions sweep down the long carpeted aisle. After Lord Ben, one of the eldest advisors, took his place in the front row, the music shifted. Down the aisle came Vel, the off-worlder Lynetta had fallen for. He was dressed in attire that was uncommon in Laya's court, but not one he'd never seen before. Laya knew it was called a tuxedo, and that it was considered fancy dress in other realms. Vel climbed the dais, coming to stand a few feet before Laya. He made a gracious bow, then smiled at the king. Laya took in his attractive features and open face. He wasn't sure what he expected, but Laya could see why Lynetta had chosen the man. He knew the lady, perhaps not well, but well enough. She'd been madly in love with her first husband, a kind, intelligent man who had suffered an accident before his 100th birthday, a sign of incredible bad fortune among the long-lived Fae. Since the unlucky man's death, Lynetta had been slow to recover. Her father, Lord Bane, had tried many times unsuccessfully to set up a new match for the lady, but she had never accepted another suitor. Until now. The music shifted again, a swelling melody filling the chamber that brought a tear to his eye. Everyone rose, including Laya himself, and the doors at the end of the hall opened, revealing one of the most beautiful brides to ever walk the realm. Not the most beautiful, Laya thought. Lynetta is stunning, but she's no match for her, the one who haunts my dreams. Her dress was made of flowing Fae fabrics that glittered and gleamed in the sunlight that streamed through the high arched windows. There was a collective gasp among those in attendance, and Laya saw that Vel was beaming at his bride. Lynetta climbed the dais, her train flowing out behind her, as she set a stately pace until she reached her husband-to-be's side. Lynetta's cheeks were pleasingly pink, and her eyes were shining with devotion. In that moment, Laya envied them their happiness. He stepped forward to take one hand from each of the couple. "We are gathered here today to observe the joining of this man to this woman. There is a saying among the Fae, love gives you wings where you had none, the better to soar to the heavens. There is truth there, as love makes our hearts soar and can be the biggest blessing of our lives." They were words he had recited many times before over the ages. Laya no longer performed every marriage ceremony as he had when Exeria was still young and new, but for those in the highest echelons of her court, it was an honor he could still choose to bestow. Despite the fact that he was reciting these words by rote did not make them any less powerful, nor did he believe them any less. "Today you are joining together in a covenant that is eternal. You promise to shelter one another, to protect, to care, to be honest, to be faithful, to be loyal." Vel and Lynetta stared into one another's eyes, the moment drawing out between them. Laya always paused at this part of the ceremony, wanting the magnitude of what they were doing to sink in fully before he secured their agreement. "Do you, Lynetta's husband, agree to the conditions of this covenant?" Vel nodded, blinking away tears. "I do." "Do you, Vel's wife, agree to the conditions of this covenant?" Lynetta's mouth opened, but for a moment no words came out. Laya peered at her, wondering why she hesitated. There was something in her eyes, a momentary flash of something that looked like panic. Then a bright smile burst across her face.
I do. Laya let out a breath, chalking the hesitate up to her saying goodbye to the memory of her first lost love. Let the covenant be joined. May it never be broken. May it never be broken, the bride and groom repeated in tandem. May it never be broken, the crowd of onlookers recited, then broke into cheers. Vel smiled, then pulled his wife into his arms for a long, slow, searing kiss. Lynetta looked dazed afterward, and she leaned on Vel as he walked them back down the stairs from the dais to the aisle. The crowd applauded and whistled as they made their way toward the large double doors. Laya watched them go, thinking of a covenant from long ago that was barely more than a forgotten memory now. The king stood, turning to exit through the door that was for his use only, back through the temple to the room he'd built with his own hands a millennia ago. It was small, only large enough for a fireplace, a long wooden table with provisions, and a comfortable chair. Laya sat there reflecting, composing himself before putting in an appearance at the post-nuptials reception at the Chimera house. He didn't relish the thought of another long dinner, but he would not insult Lord Chimera by skipping it. Still, he regretted the time it took from his search. Laya wasn't just after the force that had challenged him on his name day. He was also searching for the female Fae who had attracted his notice after that thunderclap of power she'd produced weeks ago. It had come out of nowhere, a level of power he'd scarcely seen. It was unusual for Laya not to be able to feel another Fae's power and assess it without effort. So to have such a powerful Fae appear so close was a blow to his pride. She'd also been at the feast where the evil wind had blown out his lights. It was a silly thing to do, a gesture of immaturity, but it didn't make it any less embarrassing. Laya needed to confirm for certain who was at the heart of it, although he was convinced he already knew the answer. The girl is one of the hag's minions. She must be. That is why I cannot find her. Laya could locate any individual Fae in his realm simply by sending out his magic to find them. It worked perfectly for those who dwelt within the cities under his protection, but for those in the wilds, his power could not touch. Laya figured that was where the girl was hiding. To think I was foolish enough to believe that keeping her among Kingsblade would be enough to deter bad behavior. He'd suspected the female was a trap immediately, which was why he'd sought to spend as little time in her presence as possible. He knew this represented an incursion that he could not leave unanswered. Her lure was too long ago, he told himself. The wildlings need a reminder not to stray from the boundaries and never to enter my kingdom. Laya stood, pulling himself out of his reverie and departing his small chamber of comfort. It was time to make the trek to the Chimera house. Laya had no desire to make his way through the crush of the crowd stationed outside the temple, and any sighting of his face would have them surrounding him in an instant. He waved his hand over his face, whispering the incantation that made him invisible, then let himself out of the temple and into the streets. They were still as crowded as the hour before, and Laya was relieved that he would remain unseen on his journey. The Chimera house wasn't far from the temple, but it would have become a gauntlet if he had to walk it while visible. The perks and perils of being king. The house was decked out in flowers, making Laya wonder if they bought all of the blooms for offer within 5 square miles of the city. He approached the grate and released the spell, causing the guard station next to the guardhouse to let out a scream of terror. He fell to the ground as the guard ran out, sword drawn. When he saw it was Laya, he dropped his sword and fell to his knees, begging the king not to punish him for being armed. Laya ignored them both and walked through the gate and up the walk to the front door of the massive mansion. A halfling in Chimera livery of black and gold, with a bruise on his cheek, opened the door for him, bowing deeply. Laya entered and was immediately surrounded by party guests, introducing themselves and welcoming him. It took him almost an hour to make it through 3 rooms and reach the dining room. He was seated at the head table with the bride and groom and Lord Chimera, as well as the chosen few closest to them. Others were spread out over 4 more tables that had been crowded into the otherwise expansive room. The food was exquisite, but Lia quickly lost his appetite, something in him missing simple fare, though it had been ages since he'd had any. Not like the old days. Vel and Ben were dominating the conversation, with Lynetta looking on at her new husband adoringly. Lia was naturally distrustful of those who came from off-world, but he was a permissive enough monarch to allow travel between realms and limited immigration. The Chimeras were one of the oldest families, and he knew Lord Ben to be a tough patriarch. It would not be easy to pull the wool over the old man's eyes, let alone get Lynetta to look at you in such a devoted fashion if one was not genuine. He allowed himself to relax just enough to smile politely when Vel thanked him for his attendance at their nuptials. It was later in the evening after dinner, when some of the men had retreated onto the veranda to smoke long pipes full of halfling tobacco. I consider myself a simple man, and to have such a well-respected regent perform my ceremony is more than I could have hoped for. Lia nodded. It is a testament to your bride. May you always treat her with respect and affection. How could I not? Vel said, his smile proud. Have you seen my wife? She's a knockout. Also, one of the kindest women I've ever met. I couldn't dream of doing a single thing to hurt her. Then we will get along fine. Vel laughed, raising his pipe in salute to the king before taking a long draw and blowing out the smoke in a series of concentric rings. You've given me a wedding gift of such grace that I'll never be able to repay you, but I would like to try. Lia looked at him, considering telling him that a gift is given freely and does not require repayment. Instead, he said, What did you have in mind? Since arriving in your realm, I've heard about your little problem. Problem? Lia asked casually, instantly on alert. The wilds, Vel said, gesturing toward the city walls and trees beyond them. They encroach on your settlements from time to time, or so I've heard. Lia didn't comment, just continued looking at the man until he spoke again. I mean, no offense. I wanted to offer my help with the matter, if you're open to discussing it. I've seen similar situations on other worlds, and I have some ideas you might be interested in hearing. I might indeed, Lia said, lighting his pipe and drawing deeply. Things are finally lining up, he thought as he smoked. It's about time I bring an end to the conflict and the nightmares once and for all. He blew out a plume of smoke that caught the wind flowing over the stone walls that surrounded Ixaria and into the forests beyond. The end.